The Montana sunset painted the rolling grasslands in shades of amber and violet, casting long shadows across the smoldering ruins of the Blackwood homestead.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you.
Emma Blackwood stood among the charred timbers of her barn, her late husband's Remington, revolvers strapped to her hips, watching the last wisps of smoke rise from what had once been her family's livelihood. At 32, she had already weathered more hardship than most people faced in a lifetime. The war had taken her husband, and now this. But what the thugs who torched her farm didn't know, what no one in Clearwater Valley understood, was that Emma Blackwood hadn't always been a farmer's wife. She had once been Emma Reynolds, daughter of the most feared firearms instructor in 3 territories and wife to a legendary Union Army sharpshooter. Clearwater Valley sprawled beneath the towering peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains, its patchwork of farms and ranches seeming small against the vastness of the Montana Territory. Summer was fading into autumn, the golden wheat fields swaying in the cool afternoon breeze as Emma Blackwood surveyed what remained of her property. The attack had come at dawn, 6 riders wearing bandanas over their faces, torching her barn, and threatening worse if she didn't sell her land to the Northwestern Railroad Company. They'd thought her an easy target, a young widow struggling to maintain her husband's farm alone. Their mistake had cost them nothing today, but Emma's fingers tightened around the worn grip of her husband's Remington as she silently promised that would change. Mrs. Blackwood! The voice belonged to Noah Parker, a lanky 17-year-old who helped around the farm when she could afford to pay him. He came running from the direction of the main road, his face flushed with exertion. "Riders coming! It's Sheriff Tanner and some men from town." Emma nodded, her face betraying nothing of the calculations running through her mind. She slipped the revolver back into its holster, concealing it beneath her long coat. Noah didn't question why the quiet widow suddenly carried her dead husband's guns. The boy was observant but knew when to keep his questions to himself, a quality Emma appreciated. Sheriff Walter Tanner was a broad-shouldered man whose once impressive frame had softened with age and a fondness for the whiskey served at Clearwater's only saloon. He rode at the head of a small group of townsmen, his expression grim as he surveyed the blackened skeleton of Emma's barn. "Terrible business, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, dismounting with a grunt. "Noah rode into town with the news. Any idea who might have done this?" Emma studied the sheriff carefully. Walter Tanner had been a friend to her husband, or so he'd claimed. But Emma had noticed how quickly his condolences after Robert's death had turned to suggestions that she sell the farm and move back east to her family. "They wore masks," she replied evenly. "But they mentioned the railroad," said Mr. Harrison. "Would be making another offer, and I'd be wise to accept it this time." Something flickered across Tanner's face. Discomfort, perhaps, or guilt. Emma filed the reaction away, another piece in the puzzle she was assembling. Victor Harrison's. A businessman, Mrs. Blackwood. He might be aggressive in his negotiations, but I can't imagine him ordering something like this. Tanner gestured to the ruins of her barn. "I didn't say he ordered it, Sheriff," Emma responded, her voice cool. "I'm merely telling you what they said." One of the men who'd ridden in with Tanner stepped forward. Frank Sullivan, the owner of Clearwater's General Store. Unlike the sheriff, Sullivan met Emma's gaze directly. "The railroad's been buying up land all through the valley, Emma. Folks who refuse their offers have been having accidents. The Peterson place had a mysterious fire last month, right after Thomas turned down Harrison's offer." Tanner shot Sullivan a warning look, but the storekeeper stood his ground. "She deserves to know what she's up against, Walter." "I'm simply suggesting," the sheriff said, his tone placating, "that a woman alone might be better off taking the money. This land is going to be worth a lot less once the railroad decides on a different route." Emma said nothing, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. Her father had taught her that technique long ago. People reveal more when they feel compelled to fill a silence. Finally, she spoke. "My husband believed this land was worth fighting for, Sheriff. I won't dishonor his memory by abandoning it at the first sign of trouble." Tanner sighed, clearly having expected this response. "At least consider posting a couple of men here. Sullivan or I could spare." "That won't be necessary," Emma interrupted. "Noah and the others who work for me can keep watch." What Emma didn't mention was that she needed no protection. 6 years married to Robert Blackwood, 4 years running the farm alone after his death. These were merely the most recent chapters of her life. Few in Clearwater knew anything about the 22 years that came before, when she was Emma Reynolds, daughter of Franklin Deadeye. Reynolds, the man who had trained more than half the sharpshooters in the Union Army. After the men left, Emma walked the boundaries of her property as the day's light faded. The 300-acre farm sat at a critical junction where Clearwater Creek met the Bitterroot River, precisely why the Northwestern Railroad wanted it so badly. Their planned route required this land for the most economical path through the valley. Robert had understood this when he purchased the property 10 years earlier, long before the railroad had set its sights on Montana territory. As darkness settled over the valley, Emma returned to the farmhouse. It was a sturdy 2-story structure Robert had built with his own hands, using timber from the wooded northern section of their property. She lit the lamps and moved toward the back of the house, to a door that appeared to lead to a root cellar. The heavy oak door opened to reveal stone steps descending into darkness. Emma took a lamp and made her way down, the familiar smell of earth and gun oil greeting her. Robert's workshop looked untouched, just as he'd left it before departing for his final hunting trip 4 years ago. The accident that took his life, a fall from a mountain trail that broke his neck, had been investigated by Sheriff Tanner and ruled a disaster. Emma had accepted this at the time, grief clouding any suspicions. Now she wondered. The underground room extended beyond what anyone visiting the house might suspect. One section contained preserved foods and supplies, a genuine root cellar, but behind a false wall lay Robert's true legacy. Emma slid aside the concealed panel, revealing an armory that would have impressed even her father. Rifles of various makes lined one wall, from traditional long guns to the newer repeating rifles. A glass-fronted cabinet held an assortment of handguns, revolvers, derringers, and even a few rare European pieces. Boxes of ammunition were neatly arranged on shelves, alongside cleaning kits and repair tools. But it wasn't the weapons themselves that made this collection special. It was the modifications. Robert Blackwood had been more than a farmer. He had been one of the most gifted gunsmiths in the country before seeking a quieter life after the war. Each weapon in this room had been customized, improved for accuracy, reliability, or concealment. The Remington revolvers Emma now carried had been balanced perfectly for her hands, their triggers adjusted to require exactly the pressure she preferred. Beside the weapons stood a bookcase containing volumes on firearms, design, ballistics, and combat tactics. Interspersed among these were journals, dozens of them, filled with Robert's meticulous notes and designs. Emma pulled one from the shelf, opening it to a page marked with a ribbon. The diagram showed a modification to a standard army rifle, improving its accuracy at long range. Notes in Robert's precise handwriting detailed the mathematical calculations supporting the design. Emma ran her fingers over the page, remembering the nights she'd spent watching him work at the desk in the corner, lamplight reflecting off his spectacles as he refined his ideas. They had been partners in this, her knowledge of shooting techniques complementing his mechanical genius. Together, they had created weapons of unprecedented precision, weapons that had been sold discreetly to discerning clients across the country. The railroad couldn't have known about this room, about the secrets it contained.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
They saw only a widow struggling to maintain a farm, not a woman trained from childhood to hit targets at distances that most marksmen would consider impossible. Not the daughter of Franklin Reynolds, whose shooting school in Pennsylvania had produced the finest marksmen in the nation. Not the wife of Robert Blackwood, who had turned weapons design into an art form. Emma replaced the journal and moved to a trunk in the corner. The brass lock opened with a key she kept on a chain around her neck. Inside lay her past, the modified Springfield rifle her father had given her on her 16th birthday, the medals Robert had won in shooting competitions before the war, and a folded paper she hadn't looked at in years. She opened it carefully, revealing a faded document bearing the seal of the United States government. A letter of commendation to Sergeant Robert Blackwood for his service as a sharpshooter during the Battle of Gettysburg, signed by General Meade himself. Robert had never displayed it, never spoke of his time in the war. Like many who had seen too much death, he had sought peace in the quiet work of farming. Emma refolded the letter and placed it back in the trunk. She had honored his desire for a peaceful life, keeping her own skills with firearms private during their marriage. Even after his death, she had maintained the pretense of being simply a farmer's widow, revealing nothing of her abilities or knowledge. That pretense ended today. From the trunk, she withdrew a leather-bound book, her father's manual on marksmanship, the techniques he had developed over decades of study. She had memorized every page, but it comforted her to see his handwriting, to remember the hours they had spent together on the shooting range he'd built behind their Pennsylvania home. Franklin Reynolds had not raised his daughter to be a victim. When her mother died of influenza, leaving him with a 7-year-old girl to raise alone, he had simply incorporated Emma into every aspect of his life, including his shooting school. By the time she was 12, she could outshoot most of his adult students. By 16, she was helping to train them. It was at the school that she had met Robert, a quiet, intense young man with an engineer's mind and a natural gift for shooting. They had been married just weeks before the war broke out, and then Robert was gone, serving as a sharpshooter for the Union. Emma had continued teaching at her father's school, training the men who would follow her husband into battle. After the war, Robert returned changed, as all soldiers were. His skills were sharper, but his soul was weary. When he proposed they leave Pennsylvania and start fresh in the Montana Territory, Emma had agreed. Her father had recently passed. The shooting school was declining in enrollment as the nation tired of war, and the promise of open space and quiet days appealed to them both. For 6 years, they had lived happily on this farm, growing wheat and raising a few cattle, selling Robert's modified weapons to a select clientele through discreet channels. Their reputation in those circles was legendary. The Blackwood firearms were considered the finest available at any price, but here in Clearwater Valley, they were simply hard-working farmers, private but respected. Then came the hunting accident that left Emma a widow, and 3 years of struggling to maintain the farm alone. The land was productive, and she hired help when needed, but it was a constant challenge. Still, she had managed, and might have continued indefinitely if not for the railroad's expansion plans. The first offer from Northwestern Railroad had come 6 months ago, a fair price, but Emma had declined. The second offer, a month later, was more generous but still unwelcome. The third came with veiled threats about the difficulty a widow might face maintaining such a large property alone. And now this, her barn burned, her livestock scattered, a clear message that the next target might be her home, or Emma herself. Emma closed the trunk and stood, her decision made. She would not be driven from her land, not by threats, not by fire, not by men who thought a woman alone would be easily intimidated. The railroad and whoever was acting on their behalf were about to learn a costly lesson about underestimating their opponent. She selected additional weapons from the armory. A lever-action Winchester rifle with Robert's improved sight, a small derringer that could be concealed in her sleeve, and extra ammunition for the Remingtons already on her hips. Each piece was loaded and checked with practiced precision, her movements automatic after years of training. As she worked, Emma considered her next steps. The men who burned her barn would return, perhaps as soon as tomorrow, expecting to find her cowed and ready to sell. Instead, they would face a woman prepared to defend what was hers. But simple defense wasn't enough. She needed to understand who exactly she was fighting, how far up the railroad chain the corruption extended, and who in Clearwater might be complicit. Sheriff Tanner's reaction suggested he knew more than he was saying. His quick defense of Victor Harrison, the railroad's land agent, had been telling. And there were others in town whose loyalties might be divided. The mayor, who spoke constantly of the prosperity the railroad would bring, the banker who had suddenly become reluctant to extend credit to farms along the proposed route. Emma needed information, and for that she needed allies. Frank Sullivan had shown courage in speaking up about the Peterson fire. Noah Parker was young but observant and loyal, and there were others in the valley who had refused to sell, who might join together if someone took the lead. A noise from outside interrupted her thoughts. The sound of a horse approaching at a walking pace, a single rider moving without haste. Emma extinguished the lamp and moved silently up the cellar stairs, retrieving a loaded rifle from beside the door before peering through the front window. The moon had risen, casting enough light to reveal a familiar figure dismounting at her gate. Caleb Hawkins, who owned the neighboring farm to the east. At 50, Hawkins was a widower himself, his wife having passed from consumption 2 winters prior. He had children, though, grown sons who helped run his sizable operation. Emma had always found him to be fair in his dealings, if somewhat reserved. She opened the door before he could knock, the rifle held casually but visibly at her side. Hawkins removed his hat, running a hand through greying hair. "Evening, Mrs. Blackwood. Hope I'm not disturbing you at this hour." "What brings you by, Mr. Hawkins?" Emma asked, not inviting him in but not turning him away either. "Heard about your barn," he said, his expression grim. "My boys and I, we wanted you to know we're watching. Had some trouble ourselves last month. Someone cut our fences, scattered half our herd. It took 3 days to round them all up." Emma studied him, weighing his words against what she knew of the man. "The railroad made you an offer too, I take it?" Hawkins nodded. 3 times now, each one higher than the last. My family worked this land for 15 years. My wife is buried here, not interested in selling at any price." He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "There's others who feel the same. Sullivan, of course. The Jenkins place south of town. Old Man Whitaker, up on the ridge. A coalition of the unwilling," Emma said, a slight smile touching her lips, something like that. Hawkins shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with extended conversation. "Just wanted you to know. You're not alone in this fight, Mrs. Blackwood. Whatever's coming, well, neighbors should stand together." After Hawkins left, Emma remained on the porch, considering this new development. Allies were forming naturally, drawn together by a common threat. But alliance required trust, and trust required honesty. Sooner or later, she would need to reveal her true capabilities to those who stood with her. For now, though, she would wait and watch. The men who burned her barn would return, expecting a frightened widow. Instead, they would find Emma Reynolds, Blackwood, daughter of a legendary firearms instructor, wife of a master gunsmith, and a woman who had never missed a shot in her life. Let them come. She was ready. Dawn broke over Clearwater Valley with a chill that hinted at the coming autumn. Emma Blackwood had been awake for hours, moving through the familiar routine her father had drilled into her since childhood: stretching exercises to loosen muscles, precision drills with the Remington revolvers, and a careful check of the defensive positions she'd established around her property during the night. She'd slept little, expecting the men who'd burned her barn to return quickly, to assess their handiwork. When the first fingers of sunlight stretched across the eastern hills, Emma was perched on the roof of her house, the Winchester rifle across her lap, a mug of hot coffee warming her hands. From this vantage point, she could see clear to the main road, as well as the approaches from both north and south along the creek. Noah Parker arrived just after sunrise, his young face set with determination. Emma watched him tie his horse at what remained of the corral fence, then paused to survey the blackened ruins of the barn. His shoulders squared, and Emma felt a flicker of appreciation for the boy's loyalty. She climbed down from her observation, imposed, and met him by the kitchen door. "Ma'am," Noah nodded, removing his hat. "Brought some of Pa's tools. Thought we might start clearing away the mess." He hesitated. "Figured we could salvage some of the iron fittings, maybe enough timber to rebuild the chicken coop at least." Emma studied him, noting the rifle slung across his back. An old Springfield, well-maintained, but nothing like the modified weapons in Robert's workshop. Noah caught her glance and squared his shoulders. "Figured you might need an extra pair." "Advise around the place," he said, a slight tremor in his voice betraying his youth. "Those men who did this, folks in town say they'll be back." Instead of answering directly, Emma gestured toward the barn. "How's your shooting, Noah?" The boy blinked, surprised by the question. "Fair, I guess. Pa taught me. Can hit a deer at 100 yards most days. A stationary target in good light," Emma noted. "What about a moving target? What about multiple targets? What about when your hands are cold or you're out of breath from running?" Noah's expression fell. "Never had cause to find out, Mrs. Blackwood." Emma nodded, having expected this answer. "Come with me," she said, leading him not toward the burned barn but to the house. "There's something you should see." She paused at the door to the root cellar, weighing her decision. Noah Parker was young, but he had proven loyal and level-headed. If she was going to build a defense of her property, she needed people she could trust, people she could train. "What I'm about to show you stays between us," she said, fixing him with a stern look. "My husband valued his privacy, and I've honored that since his passing, but circumstances have changed." Noah nodded, his expression solemn. "Yes, ma'am. I won't say a word." Emma led him down the steps into Robert's workshop, lighting lamps to reveal the astonishing collection. Noah's eyes widened as he took in the arsenal, the workbenches, the books and diagrams. "Mr. Blackwood was a gunsmith?" he asked, his voice hushed with awe. "One of the finest in the country," Emma confirmed, though few knew it. He preferred a quiet life after the war. She ran her fingers along the barrel of a custom rifle. "These aren't just weapons, Noah. They're precision instruments, each one modified for improved accuracy, balance, and reliability." She turned to face the boy directly. "What those men who burned my barn don't know, what no one in Clearwater knows, is that I was raised by one of the most renowned shooting instructors in America. My father trained military marksmen, lawmen, and private citizens in the art of defensive shooting. I was handling firearms before I could read." Noah's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching reverence. "You mean you know how to use all these?" Emma allowed herself a small smile. "Better than most, yes. Robert and I met at my father's shooting school. We shared a passion for ballistics and marksmanship that became the foundation of our marriage." She retrieved a lever-action rifle from the wall, one modified with Robert's improved sights and a custom stock. "This is chambered for 44-40, same as the revolvers I carry. The ammo is interchangeable, which can be crucial in a prolonged engagement." She handed it to Noah, who accepted it with careful hands. The action is smoother than the factory standard. Robert filed and polished the internal components to reduce friction. Noah worked the lever, his eyes widening at the fluid motion. "It's like butter," he murmured. "Exactly." Emma took the rifle back, returning it to its place. "I'm telling you this because I need your help, Noah. Not just with rebuilding, but with defending this place. The men who burned my barn will return, and when they do, I intend to be ready. You're going to fight them?" The boy's voice held both fear and excitement. "I'm going to defend what's mine," Emma corrected. "There's a difference. I won't initiate violence, but I will respond to it with whatever force is necessary." She paused, studying his reaction. "It's not a game, Noah. Men could die. I need to know if that's something you can stomach." Noah swallowed hard, but met her gaze. "Those men tried to burn you out of your home, Mrs. Blackwood. They wouldn't have shed a tear if you'd been inside that barn when they set it ablaze." "I reckon they made their choice," Emma nodded, satisfied with his understanding. "Then let's begin. First lesson, how to move around the property using natural cover, staying out of sight while maintaining good observation points." As the morning progressed, Emma put Noah through a series of exercises designed to improve his awareness and defensive positioning. She was pleased to discover he was a quick study, absorbing her father's techniques with enthusiasm and showing natural aptitude for tactical thinking. By midday, they had established a series of signals and defensive positions around the property. Emma sent Noah to eat lunch, while she returned to her observation post on the roof, the Winchester across her lap. The valley stretched before her, peaceful in the autumn sunlight, belying the tensions simmering beneath the surface. Movement on. The main road caught her attention, a group of riders approaching from the direction of town. Emma counted 6 men moving at an unhurried pace. Even at this distance, she recognized Victor Harrison at the lead, his expensive Eastern suit making him stand out among the roughly dressed men who accompanied him. Harrison was the Northwestern Railroad's land agent, a man in his 40s with carefully cultivated manners that barely concealed his ruthless approach to business. Emma had met him 3 times over the past 6 months, each encounter more unpleasant than the last, as her continued refusal to sell tested his composure. She watched them turn onto the track that led to her farm, then climb down to alert Noah. The boy's expression hardened when she told him who was coming. "Mr. Harrison was in my Pay's store yesterday afternoon," he said, "talking with Sheriff Tanner and Mayor Collins. They got quiet when I walked in to deliver a package." Emma filed this information away, another piece in the growing puzzle of local alliances and corruption. "Go to the north field," she instructed Noah. "Keep out of sight, but watch the approach. If more riders come from another direction, fire 1 shot into the air as a warning." Noah nodded and slipped away, moving with a stealth that showed he had absorbed her morning lessons well. Emma returned to the house, checking her revolvers before stepping onto the front porch. She positioned herself casually, leaning against a support post, but her posture allowed for quick movement if needed. Harrison and his men reached the edge of her property, slowing, as they took in the burned remains of the barn. A satisfied smirk crossed Harrison's face before he composed his features into a mask of concern. He led his group to the yard in front of the house, where they reined in their horses in a loose semicircle. "Mrs. Blackwood," Harrison called, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I was distressed to hear about the unfortunate fire. A terrible accident." "Was it an accident, Mr. Harrison?" Emma's voice was cool, her gaze shifting methodically among the men who accompanied him. She recognized 2 from town, a livery stable worker named Mitch Dawson and a drifter who'd been hanging around the saloon for the past month. The others were strangers, hard-faced men with the watchful eyes of predators. Harrison's smile faltered slightly at her direct question. "Why, of course it was. These old wooden structures can be terribly vulnerable to all manner of mishaps." He gestured expansively. "Which is precisely why I've come. In light of your recent difficulties. I've been authorized to increase Northwestern's offer for your property. A gesture of goodwill, you understand. He withdrew an envelope from his jacket pocket. $15,000, Mrs. Blackwood. A very generous sum for land that, while certainly picturesque, is bound to become increasingly difficult for a woman alone to maintain. Emma made no move to take the envelope, especially when that woman faces accidents orchestrated by men willing to destroy what they cannot legally acquire. A flash of anger crossed Harrison's face, quickly suppressed. One of the hard-faced strangers, a tall man with a jagged scar running down his cheek, shifted in his saddle, his hand dropping casually to rest near his holstered revolver. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Blackwood," Harrison said, his voice hardening. "One that a prudent person in your vulnerable position might think twice about making." Emma's eyes locked with the scarred man's, noting his subtle change in posture, weight shifting forward, fingers flexing near his weapon. "An experienced gunman preparing for action. I recognize your friend with the scar," she said conversationally, still addressing Harrison, though her eyes remained on the gunman. "Luke Cordell, isn't it? Wanted in Colorado for the murder of 3 miners who refused to sell their claim to Denver Pacific last year." Cordell's eyes narrowed dangerously, and Harrison's mask of civility slipped further. "You are mistaken, madam. This is John Smith, one of our security personnel." "Is that so?" Emma smiled slightly. "Interesting that John Smith has the same distinctive scar as Luke Cordell, the same custom-modified Colt with the filed-down hammer, the same habit of shifting his weight to his left foot when preparing to draw." A tense silence fell over the group. The other men were now watching Cordell, or Smith, with new wariness, realizing that this widow had recognized a wanted man at a glance. "You seem remarkably observant for a farmer's wife, Mrs. Blackwood," Harrison said carefully. "I'm full of surprises, Mr. Harrison." Emma's posture hadn't changed, still seemingly relaxed against the porch post, but she had calculated the distance to each man, noted their positions, analyzed their likely reactions. Her father's training ingrained through thousands of hours of practice. Harrison studied her for a long moment, then forced another smile. "Well, our offer stands regardless of your colorful imagination regarding my associates. $15,000 is more than fair for this property. The property isn't for sale at any price, Mr. Harrison. Not to you, not to Northwestern Railroad, not to anyone." Emma straightened, her hands loose at her sides. "Now, I suggest you and your men leave my land before I mistake you for trespassers with ill intent." Harrison's face flushed with anger. "Be reasonable, woman. You can't possibly think—" A shot rang out from the direction of the north field, Noah's warning signal. Emma's reaction was instantaneous. In one fluid motion, she drew both Remington revolvers, her movement so swift that Harrison's men barely had time to register what was happening before they found themselves staring down the barrels of her weapons. "It seems we have more visitors approaching from the north," she said calmly, as though discussing the weather. "Perhaps more of your security personnel, Mr. Harrison." The railroad man's face had gone pale at the speed of her draw. Cordell, more experienced in such matters, had frozen with his hand halfway to his gun, recognizing the deadly proficiency in Emma's stance and grip. "Mrs. Blackwood," Harrison said, his voice strained, "there's no need for this display. We are simply here to conduct business." "Business conducted at gunpoint ceased to be legitimate commerce some time ago," Emma replied. "Now you have 2 choices. You can leave peacefully, taking whoever is approaching from the north with you, or you can discover firsthand why my father's students called him Deadeye Reynolds." The name dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples of recognition through the group. Cordell's eyes widened, and even Harrison seemed to recognize the significance. Reynolds, Cordell said, his voice low. Franklin. Reynolds, my father, Emma confirmed. He taught me everything he knew before I was 18. And my husband, Robert Blackwood, was the finest gunsmith east of the Mississippi before we moved west. The weapons I'm holding were custom modified by him for my hands, my grip strength, and my shooting style. She tilted her head slightly. The right-hand Remington has a trigger pull of exactly 3 pounds, 2 ounces. The left is set at 3 pounds even, compensating for the slight difference in strength between my dominant and non-dominant hands. The cylinders turn as smooth as silk, and the balance is perfect. Harrison had gone very still, finally recognizing the depth of his miscalculation. What he had taken for an isolated, vulnerable widow was in fact a highly trained markswoman from one of the most respected shooting lineages in the country. There must be some misunderstanding, he began, his tone conciliatory. We certainly meant no threat. The sound of approaching riders grew louder. Emma's gaze never wavered from Harrison and his men. Tell your reinforcements to keep their distance, Mr. Harrison, she said. My young friend Noah has a clear shot at the approach road, and while he lacks my training, he's quite capable of hitting a man at 200 yards. Harrison hesitated, then turned in his saddle, waving frantically at the approaching riders. Hold up, hold position, he shouted. Through the trees, Emma could see 4 more men reining in their horses, clearly confused by the order. She recognized the same type. Hired guns, probably more of Cordell's associates brought in for security. Now, Emma continued, you're going to leave my property, all of you, and you're going to carry a message back to whoever at Northwestern authorized these tactics. My land is not for sale. Any further attempts to intimidate me or damage my property will be met with force. Cordell, having recovered some of his composure, offered a thin smile. 10 against 1, Mrs. Blackwood. Those aren't odds I'd bet on, Deadeye's daughter or not. Emma's expression didn't change. 6 men burned my barn yesterday, Mr. Cordell. I was watching from the ridge with my husband's Whitworth sniper rifle, the same model he used at Gettysburg. I identified each one. I calculated the range, the wind drift, the bullet drop. I could have put a bullet through any one of them at over 800 yards. She let that sink in. I chose not to because I wanted to see who was giving the orders. But make no mistake, if I'd wanted those men dead, they would be in the ground now instead of riding with you today. A long silence stretched across the yard, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses. Finally, Harrison cleared his throat. We appear to have underestimated you, Mrs. Blackwood, he said stiffly. Perhaps we should reconsider our approach to this matter. That would be wise. Emma kept her revolvers trained on the group. Now ride out, slowly. Keep your hands visible. Harrison nodded to his men, and they began to turn their horses. Cordell was the last to move, his eyes locked with Emma's in a silent challenge. This isn't over, he said quietly, for her ears alone. On that, Mr. Cordell, we are in complete agreement, Emma replied, her voice equally soft. The difference is that I'll be ready when it continues. She maintained her position on the porch, revolvers steady, as Harrison and his men rode slowly back to join the second group waiting on the road. Only when they had all disappeared around the bend did she lower her weapons. Noah emerged from his hiding place in the north field, his young face flushed with excitement. Mrs. Blackwood, that was... I've never seen anything like it. The way you drew those revolvers, they didn't even have time to blink. Emma holstered her weapons, noting that her hands were steady. 10 years ago, such a confrontation would have left her shaking with adrenaline. Now she felt only a cool certainty about what must come next. They'll be back, she said, and next time they won't announce themselves so politely. We need to prepare. She gazed out across her property, the burned barn, the fields ready for harvest, the creek that made this land so valuable to the railroad. Harrison had backed down today, but men like him didn't abandon their goals easily. He would regroup, reconsider his approach, Perhaps bring in more men like Cordell. But Emma had advantages Harrison couldn't possibly understand, not just her skills and her husband's weapons, but a lifetime of strategic thinking taught by her father. Franklin Reynolds hadn't just trained his students to shoot. He had taught them to anticipate, to plan, to control the battlefield before the first shot was fired. "Come on," she said to Noah, turning toward the house. "We have work to do." As they walked, Emma's mind was already racing. Ahead, formulating plans, considering defensive positions, calculating resources. Harrison and his men had expected to find a helpless widow. Instead, they had discovered Emma Reynolds Blackwood, daughter of a legend, widow of a genius, and a woman who had spent her entire life preparing for battles she hoped would never come. The real war for Clearwater Valley had just begun. Night settled over Clearwater Valley, bringing with it a silence that seemed laden with anticipation. Emma Blackwood sat at her kitchen table, an oil lamp casting warm light over maps and diagrams spread across the worn wooden surface. Noah had gone home at sunset, promising to return at first light with his father's tools and, more importantly, news from town. The confrontation with Harrison and his men had shifted the landscape of the conflict. They now knew she wasn't defenseless, but that knowledge was a double-edged sword. While it might make them hesitate, it would also push them to adapt, perhaps to strike more decisively, with greater numbers and better planning. Emma's pencil moved across a hand-drawn map of her property, marking key defensive positions, lines of sight, potential vulnerabilities. Robert had surveyed every inch of their land when they first purchased it, creating detailed topographical drawings that now proved invaluable for strategic planning. A soft knock at the back door interrupted her thoughts. Emma moved silently to the window, Remington in hand, and peered through the curtain before relaxing slightly. Caleb Hawkins stood on her back porch, alone and unarmed from what she could see. She opened the door, still keeping the revolver visible at her side. "Mr. Hawkins, twice in 2 days. I'm beginning to think you've developed a fondness for evening visits." Hawkins removed his hat, looking uncomfortable. "Word travels fast in Clearwater, Mrs. Blackwood. Heard there was some trouble earlier today with Harrison and his men." "News certainly does move quickly," Emma replied, studying him carefully. "I wonder who carried that particular tale." "Sheriff Tanner, perhaps?" "Sullivan, actually." He saw Harrison and his men riding back into town, looking like they'd seen a ghost. Hawkins shifted his weight. "Talk is you pulled guns on them, fast draw, they're saying. Like something out of a dime novel." Emma considered her options. Hawkins had been forthright yesterday about standing with her against the railroad. If she was going to build alliances, she needed to start somewhere. "You'd better come in, Mr. Hawkins," she said, stepping back from the door. "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about what we're facing." She led him to the kitchen, clearing away some of her maps to make space at the table. Hawkins took the offered seat, his weathered face revealing nothing as he looked. Around the modest room. "Coffee?" Emma offered. "Wouldn't say no." He nodded, seeming relieved at the mundane courtesy. As Emma prepared the pot, Hawkins finally spoke again. "My oldest boy, James, he was in town this afternoon. Overheard some of Harrison's men talking at the saloon. They're bringing in more guns, professional types from back east, men with reputations." Emma set the coffee pot on the stove and turned to face him. "I expected as much. Harrison isn't the type to accept defeat gracefully." "No, ma'am, he is not." Hawkins studied her with newfound curiosity. "Sullivan says you handled those revolvers like you were born with them in your hands. Said Harrison's gunman, fella with a scar, looked like he'd seen his own funeral when you drew on him." Emma poured the coffee when it was ready, buying time as she decided how much to reveal. She set a steaming mug before Hawkins and took her own seat across from him. "My father was Franklin Reynolds," she said simply, watching. For recognition, it came immediately. Hawkins' eyes widened, and he set his coffee down carefully. Deadeye Reynolds, the shooting instructor. Emma nodded. The same. He raised me after my mother died. Taught me everything he knew about firearms and tactical thinking. I was helping. Train army sharpshooters at his school by the time I was 16. And your husband? Folks always said Robert Blackwood was a quiet man. Good farmer, kept to himself. Robert was a student at my father's school before the war, the finest natural marksman I'd ever seen, and a brilliant gunsmith. Emma's voice softened at the memory. He modified weapons for elite shooting competitions, then for the Union Army during the war. His rifles were used by sharpshooter units at Gettysburg and Antietam. Hawkins absorbed this information, nodding slowly. So, when you and your husband settled here, we were looking for peace. Emma finished. Robert had seen too much death in the war. We wanted quiet lives, a place to raise a family. Her expression hardened. But we weren't naive. Robert built a workshop beneath this house. Every weapon he modified, every improvement he designed, they're all here, along with my father's tactical manuals, shooting records, everything. She leaned forward. Harrison and his men thought they were threatening a helpless widow. They've discovered their mistake, but that only makes them more dangerous. They'll come back with more men, better planning, and I need to know who stands with me when they do. Hawkins took a long drink of his coffee, then set the mug down with deliberation. My place sits on the creek just like yours. The railroad wants it for the same reason. I've got 3 grown sons, all good with rifles. Nothing fancy like what you're describing, but they can hit what they aim at. He met her gaze directly. We stand with you, Mrs. Blackwood. So will Sullivan. Probably the Jenkins family too. And the rest of Clearwater, the sheriff, the mayor. Hawkins grimaced. Mayor Collins has been singing the railroad's praises since they first came sniffing around. Talks about progress, prosperity, the future of the territory. Sheriff Tanner. He hesitated. Walter was a good man once. Fought for the Union. Same as your husband, but he owes money to the bank and Mayor Collins sits on the bank's board. Draw your own conclusions. Emma nodded, unsurprised. What about the townspeople? Where do they stand? Divided, Hawkins admitted. Some see dollar signs when they hear railroad, more business, higher property values. Others remember what happened over in Silverton when Northwestern came through. Small businesses pushed out, land seized through questionable means, promises, broken once the rails were laid. He leaned forward, his voice lowering despite the fact they were alone. There's something else. 2 nights ago a man came to see me, dressed like an Easterner, but carried himself like a lawman. Said he was with the U.S. Marshal's office, investigating Northwestern for land fraud in 3 territories. Emma's attention sharpened. Did he give a name? Daniel Walsh. Showed me papers, looked official enough. Said he couldn't go to the sheriff because he didn't know who to trust in local law enforcement. This was significant news. If true, Emma had learned early to question convenient developments. What did he want from you? Information about Northwestern's tactics here in Clearwater, names of landowners who'd been pressured or threatened. Hawkins shrugged. I told him what I knew, mentioned you and the others who've refused to sell. He seemed particularly interested in your situation after I mentioned the barn burning. Where is this Marshal Walsh now? Staying at Sullivan's place, keeping out of sight. Sullivan's got rooms above his store, lets him come and go without being noticed. Hawkins finished his coffee. He wants to meet you. Said he's gathering evidence for a federal case against Northwestern, but needs statements from affected landowners. Emma considered this development. A federal investigation could change everything, or it could be an elaborate trap. Harrison was cunning enough to plant a fake marshal to gather intelligence on those opposing the railroad. I'll need to verify his credentials, she said finally. But if he's legitimate, this could give us leverage beyond what guns alone can provide. Hawkins nodded, rising from his chair. Sullivan can arrange a meeting. Tomorrow night, perhaps. He reached for his hat. One more thing. Harrison's scheduled a town meeting for the day after tomorrow. calling it a community discussion about the railroad's benefits to Clearwater. More likely, a chance to pressure those still holding out and shore up support among the townspeople. A public forum, Emma mused. That could work to our advantage, if handled properly. My thoughts exactly, Hawkins agreed, moving toward the door. We can discuss it more tomorrow. For now, I should get back. My boys will worry if I'm gone too long in these unsettled times. After Hawkins departed, Emma returned to her maps with renewed focus. If Marshal Walsh was genuine, legal recourse might eventually resolve the situation. But eventually was cold comfort against the immediate threat Harrison posed. She needed to prepare for the worst while hoping for better outcomes. She worked late into the night, planning defensive positions, cataloging weapons and ammunition, developing contingencies for various scenarios. Robert had taught her that preparation was the cornerstone of survival, a lesson he'd learned in the brutal crucible of war. Dawn brought Noah Parker as promised, along with his father's tools, and more valuably, fresh intelligence from town. Harrison's men were drinking heavy at the saloon last night, the boy reported as he helped Emma clear debris from the burnt barn. Heard from Jim at the livery that they've sent for more men, 10, maybe 15 more, coming in on tomorrow's stage from Helena. Emma nodded, unsurprised. And the mood in town? How are people talking about what happened here? Noah straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. Mixed. Some folks are saying you threatened innocent men doing railroad business. Others... He grinned suddenly. Others are saying Emma Blackwood drew faster than lightning and stood down Luke Cordell himself. Been arguing about it at the saloon. Cordell's reputation precedes him, it seems. Yes, 3 men dead in Colorado, they're saying. 2 more in Wyoming territory. Noah's expression sobered. Bad business, Mrs. Blackwood. These aren't just railroad men, they're killers. All the more reason to be prepared, Emma replied, setting down the charred beam she'd been moving. Come with me. Time for your next lesson. She led him to the creek that marked the eastern boundary of her property. A series of targets had been set up along the bank, bottles and cans at varying distances. Your Springfield, Emma said, gesturing, to the rifle slung across Noah's back. Let's see how it shoots. Noah unslung the weapon, checking it with the careful movements of someone raised to respect firearms. My pa's had this since the war, he said proudly. Says it's never failed him. It's a solid weapon, Emma agreed. But it could be better. Take your time. Show me how you shoot. She watched as Noah took aim at the targets, firing 5 shots with moderate success, 3 hits, 2 misses at the more distant targets. His fundamentals were sound, if unrefined. More importantly, he remained steady under observation, showing no tendency toward rushed shots or bravado. Good, Emma said when he'd finished. Now let's talk about how to improve both the shooter and the tool. She spent the next hour working with Noah on his stance, his breathing, his sight alignment, the basics her father had drilled into thousands of students. The boy absorbed the instruction eagerly, his natural ability flourishing under proper guidance. When they returned to the house, Emma took him once more into Robert's workshop, this time with a specific purpose. She selected tools from the workbench and began making subtle adjustments to Noah's Springfield, smoothing the action, improving the trigger pull, adjusting the sights to match his specific vision. My husband believed that a weapon should be an extension of its user, she explained as she worked. Not just any rifle, but your rifle, fitted to your hands, your eyes, your shooting style. Noah watched with fascination as she made precise adjustments, testing the action between modifications, explaining each change. By the time she finished, the Springfield looked much the same, but felt entirely different in his hands, smoother, more responsive, an extension of his will rather than a tool to be wrestled with. Try it now, Emma said, leading him back to the targets by the creek. Noah's improvement was immediate and dramatic. 5 shots, 5 hits, even at the most distant targets. His face lit with amazement as he lowered the rifle. "It's like it knows where I want the bullet to go," he breathed. Emma nodded, satisfied. That's exactly what Robert aimed for with every weapon he modified. Now, let's talk about defensive positions on the property. As they walked the boundaries of the farm, Emma outlined her strategy. In a conflict like this, our advantage is knowledge of the terrain. Harrison's men are strangers here. They don't know the sightlines, the natural cover, the best approaches. She showed Noah the defensive positions she'd identified, places where a single shooter could control a significant area of the property while remaining protected from return fire. They spent hours practicing movement between these positions, developing signals, establishing fields of fire that would overlap for maximum coverage. By mid-afternoon, Frank Sullivan arrived from town, his wagon loaded with supplies, lumber, nails, tools for rebuilding, but also ammunition, food provisions, and medical supplies discreetly packed beneath tarpaulins. "Thought you might need restocking," the storekeeper said as they unloaded the wagon. "Figured it best to bring everything at once. Avoid drawing attention with repeated trips." Emma noted this practical thinking with approval. Sullivan was proving to be a valuable ally, connected, observant, and clear-eyed about the situation. They faced. "Hawkins mentioned you might have a guest staying above your store," she said when Noah was out of earshot. "Someone with a federal interest in our railroad troubles." Sullivan glanced around before responding. "Marshal Walsh arrived 3 days ago, keeping a low profile. Seems legitimate. Showed me his credentials, asked smart questions about Northwestern's operations here. I'd like to meet him. Tonight, if possible." Sullivan nodded. "Can arrange that. 9 o'clock back entrance to my store. He's been wanting to speak with you anyway, especially after what happened with Harrison yesterday." As Sullivan prepared to leave, he hesitated. "Harrison's called a town meeting for tomorrow afternoon. Every property owner in the valley is invited to hear about the bright future Northwestern has planned for Clearwater." "So I've heard," Emma replied. "Will you attend?" "Wouldn't miss it." Sullivan's normally genial face hardened. "Someone needs to speak the truth about what's really happening here." Emma considered this. "A public confrontation could work in our favor if handled correctly. The railroad operates best in shadows, backroom deals, private threats, midnight fires. Bringing their tactics into the open might shift public opinion." "My thoughts exactly." Sullivan climbed onto his wagon. "Though Harrison won't make it easy. He's smooth-talking, and some folks are blinded by promises of prosperity." After Sullivan departed, Emma continued Noah's training, focusing now on practical defensive tactics, how to move silently, use natural cover, identify and respond to threats. The boy proved an apt pupil, his youth counterbalanced by serious attention to her instructions. As evening approached, Emma sent Noah home with strict instructions to return at dawn. She spent the hours alone conducting maintenance on Robert's weapons, cleaning and checking each one with methodical precision. The familiar routine was meditative, allowing her mind to work through various scenarios for the coming confrontation. At 8:30, she saddled her horse and rode toward town, taking a circuitous route that avoided the main road. Clearwater was a small settlement, a single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church, a schoolhouse, and scattered residences. Sullivan's general store occupied a prime location at the center of town, a 2-story structure with living quarters. Above, Emma approached from the alley behind the business establishments, dismounting in the shadows and securing her horse out of sight. The back door to Sullivan's store opened before she could knock, the storekeeper ushering her quickly inside. "He's upstairs," Sullivan said, leading her through the darkened store to a narrow staircase. "Been going through Northwestern's land, acquisition records for the territory, copies he obtained from the capital." The upstairs had been converted into a small apartment, a sitting room that doubled as an office, a bedroom visible through a partially open door. A man rose from A desk covered with documents as they entered. Daniel Walsh was not what Emma had expected. Rather than the weathered frontier lawman she'd imagined, he was a lean, scholarly-looking individual in his 40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the precise mannerisms of an educated Easterner. Despite this, there was a hardness in his eyes that suggested experience beyond courtrooms and legal documents. "Mrs. Blackwood," he greeted her, extending his hand. "I've been hoping to meet you." Emma shook his hand, noting the calluses that belied his bookish appearance. "Marshal Walsh, I understand you're investigating the Northwestern Railroad. Please, sit." He gestured to chairs around a small table. "And yes, for nearly 8 months. Now, what began as a land fraud complaint in Wyoming Territory has expanded into something much larger, a pattern of systematic corruption, intimidation, and occasional violence across 3 territories. Walsh retrieved a leather portfolio from his desk, extracting documents as he sat opposite Emma. Northwestern's approach follows a consistent pattern. They identify strategic parcels needed for their planned routes, make initial offers that seem generous, then escalate pressure on holdouts through various means. Legal challenges to land titles, manipulation of water rights, economic isolation, and when necessary, direct intimidation. He spread out several maps showing Northwestern's completed and planned rail lines. Their expansion through Montana Territory is particularly aggressive. The route through Clearwater Valley would connect their northern operations to markets in the south, potentially worth millions in shipping contracts alone. Emma studied the maps, seeing her own property marked in red, alongside other strategic parcels along the valley. And Victor Harrison? Where does he fit in this operation? Harrison is what the company calls a regional acquisitions specialist, Walsh explained, his tone making clear what he thought of the euphemism. He's worked for Northwestern for 6 years, moving from region to region ahead of their expansion. His methods grow more aggressive with each new assignment. He pulled out a different document, a wanted poster featuring a crude sketch of a man with a facial scar. Luke Cordell, one of Harrison's security personnel, wanted for murder in Colorado and Wyoming, suspected in at least 4 other deaths related to land disputes. Harrison keeps a rotating crew of such men, hired guns with violent histories who create problems for landowners unwilling to sell. Emma processed this information, connecting it with her own observations and the intelligence gathered from Hawkins and Sullivan. "I understand you had a confrontation with Harrison and Cordell yesterday," Walsh continued. "Sullivan shared some details, but I'd appreciate hearing your account directly." Emma provided a concise description of the encounter, including her recognition of Cordell and her demonstration of shooting skills. Walsh listened intently, taking occasional notes. "You've done something few have managed, Mrs. Blackwood," he said when she finished. "You've upset Harrison's standard approach. He expects intimidation to work, especially against those he perceives as vulnerable, widows, elderly farmers, families with young children." "What exactly is your interest in our situation, Marshal?" Emma asked directly. "Beyond gathering evidence for some future federal case." Walsh removed his spectacles, polishing them thoughtfully before responding. 8 months ago, Northwestern's men burned out a family in Wyoming Territory when they refused to sell. A farmer named Thomas Miller, his wife Sarah, and their 3 children. The house fire was ruled an accident by the local sheriff, who, coincidentally, had recently deposited a substantial sum in his previously modest bank account. His voice remained steady, but Emma saw a flash of controlled anger in his eyes. The miller's 10-year-old son was trapped inside. He didn't survive. Walsh replaced his spectacles with deliberate care. "I was assigned to investigate allegations of land fraud. What I found was corporate murder masked by corruption. So my interest, Mrs. Blackwood, goes considerably beyond documentation for legal proceedings." I intend to see Harrison and his employers face justice, not merely financial penalties in civil court, but prison terms for the deaths they've caused. Emma studied the marshal, reassessing him. Not merely a government functionary following orders, but a man with personal investment in his mission. That made him both more valuable as an ally and potentially more unpredictable. "And how do you propose we proceed in Clearwater?" she asked. "Harrison has called a town meeting tomorrow," Walsh replied, "a perfect opportunity to shift public perception. Northwestern relies on dividing communities, portraying holdouts as obstacles to progress while buying support from local officials and businesses. If enough citizens understand the company's true methods, their social leverage diminishes." Sullivan, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. "The meeting's at 3 o'clock at the schoolhouse. Every landowner in the valley's been invited, along with town business owners." Emma considered the strategic implications. A public confrontation could force Harrison to moderate his tactics, at least temporarily, but it could also push him toward more desperate measures if he feels his control of the situation slipping. Walsh nodded grimly. "Which is why we need to be prepared for both outcomes. I've sent telegrams requesting additional federal agents, but they're at least 4 days away. Until then, we're on our own against whatever Harrison has planned." As the three continued their discussion late into the evening, Emma felt the pieces of a cohesive strategy beginning to form. Harrison had expected to find a vulnerable widow, easily intimidated into selling her valuable property. Instead, he had encountered unexpected resistance that threatened to expose Northwestern's entire pattern of corruption and violence. The coming days would determine whether Emma and her growing circle of allies could withstand the railroad's response, and whether Clearwater Valley would remain in the hands of those who had worked its land for years, or fall to the advancing tide of corporate expansion sweeping across the Western Territories. The schoolhouse in Clearwater was filled beyond capacity by 3 o'clock the following afternoon. Every bench was occupied with additional townspeople, and farmers from the surrounding valley standing along the walls and spilling out onto the porch. Emma Blackwood sat between Frank Sullivan and Caleb Hawkins in the third row, acutely aware of the murmurs and glances directed her way. Word of her confrontation with Harrison and his men had spread through the community like wildfire, growing more exaggerated with each retelling. Some versions claimed she had disarmed Luke Cordell with a single shot. Others suggested she had held off a dozen gunmen single-handedly. Emma had made no effort to correct these embellishments, understanding that her growing legend might serve as both protection and deterrent. Marshal Walsh was nowhere to be seen, having decided his presence would alert Harrison to federal interest prematurely. Instead, he remained at Sullivan's store, reviewing documents and preparing legal papers that might be needed in the aftermath of the meeting. At the front of the schoolroom, Mayor Collins called for order, his round face gleaming with perspiration. Despite the autumn chill, beside him sat Victor Harrison, immaculate in a charcoal suit that must have cost more than most Clearwater residents earned in months. Sheriff Tanner occupied a chair to the mayor's left, his expression carefully neutral. As he surveyed the crowd, "Friends and neighbors," the mayor began, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a small-town politician. "We've gathered today to discuss an extraordinary opportunity for our community. The Northwestern Railroad's expansion through Clearwater Valley represents progress and prosperity unmatched since the founding of our town." He gestured expansively, warming to his theme. "Increased trade, higher property values, new businesses and jobs for our children. These are just some of the benefits the railroad will bring." Mr. Victor Harrison, Northwestern's regional director, has graciously agreed to address any questions or concerns you might have about this exciting development. Harrison rose and approached the small podium, his smile confident as he surveyed the assembled residents. Thank you, Mayor Collins, for that warm introduction, and thank you all for coming today to learn more about Northwestern's vision for Clearwater's future. His gaze swept across the room, faltering slightly when it reached Emma before moving on. For those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, I'm Victor Harrison. I've been privileged to help communities across the territories embrace the transformative power of rail connectivity. Emma watched him with clinical detachment, noting the practiced gestures, the carefully modulated voice designed to project authority and trustworthiness. Harrison was good at this, presenting himself as the face of progress, positioning any opposition as backward-thinking obstacles to community prosperity. Northwestern has already purchased 70% of the needed right-of-way through the valley, Harrison continued, offering generous compensation to landowners. Our engineers have determined the optimal route, minimizing disruption while maximizing efficiency and safety. He unrolled a large map, positioning it on an easel where the community could see the planned rail line. A red stripe cutting through Clearwater Valley, directly across Emma's property and those of the other. Holdouts, we remain committed to fair dealing with all property owners, Harrison said, his tone suggesting reasonableness beyond reproach. Our latest offers represent values well above market rates, an acknowledgement of both the land's worth and the inconvenience of relocation. Emma felt Hawkins tense beside her as Harrison's gaze settled on their section of the audience. However, we are facing a deadline imposed by our financiers and the territorial authority. Construction must begin within 30 days to meet our contractual obligations. This unfortunately leaves little time for prolonged negotiations. A murmur ran through the crowd at this announcement. Harrison held up a placating hand. Northwestern prefers voluntary agreements with fair compensation, but I must be transparent. The territorial legislature has granted us certain authorities under eminent domain provisions for critical infrastructure projects. We hope not to exercise these powers, but the railroad must be built on schedule. This was a new tactic, threatening legal seizure rather than relying solely on intimidation. Emma had expected something like this, but the mention of a 30-day deadline was concerning. It suggested Harrison was operating on a tighter schedule than she had realized. Mayor Collins stepped forward again. We'll now take questions from the community. Please remember, this is a civil discussion about our collective future. Several hands went up immediately. Harrison pointed to a middle-aged shopkeeper near the front. Mr. Wilson, isn't it? From the hardware store. Wilson stood, clearly pleased at being recognized. Yes, sir. Just wondering about the train station itself. Where exactly would it be built? Some of us business owners are wondering how it might affect customer traffic. Harrison smiled broadly. An excellent question. The primary station would be constructed here. He indicated a spot on the map near the center of town, providing convenient access to Clearwater's commercial district and maximizing economic benefits for existing businesses. More questions followed about construction, jobs, shipping rates, passenger service, all answered with smooth assurances of prosperity to come. Emma noted how Harrison skillfully directed the conversation toward economic benefits, while avoiding any mention of the tactics used against holdout landowners. Finally, Frank Sullivan rose without waiting to be called upon. I have a question about Northwestern's methods, Mr. Harrison. Perhaps you could explain why Emma Blackwood's barn burned down the night after she refused your third offer for her land. A tense silence fell over the schoolhouse. Harrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm afraid I don't understand your implication, Mr. Sullivan. Mrs. Blackwood suffered an unfortunate accident, as I understand it. Northwestern had nothing to do with that tragedy. Interesting coincidence, though, Sullivan pressed. Just like the fire at the Peterson place after they declined to sell, or the cattle that mysteriously disappeared from Caleb Hawkins's north pasture last month. Harrison's composure remained intact, but Emma detected a flash of irritation in his eyes. Northwestern Railroad is a legitimate business enterprise, Mr. Sullivan, not a band of criminals. These insinuations are both unfounded and potentially slanderous. Caleb Hawkins stood next, his weathered face set in determined lines. My oldest boy tracked those missing cattle. The trail led straight to the camp where your security personnel have been staying these past 2 weeks. Coincidence there too, I suppose. Before Harrison could respond, other voices joined in, farmers and ranchers who had experienced mysterious property damage, threats, or suspicious activity after refusing Northwestern's offers. Each incident in isolation might have been dismissed as misfortune or exaggeration, but the pattern emerging through their collective testimony was unmistakable. Harrison raised his hands, his expression now one of wounded dignity. Please, please. These are serious accusations being made without evidence. I understand that change can be frightening, that progress sometimes meets resistance from those comfortable with the status quo. But to suggest that Northwestern would employ criminal tactics is simply outrageous. Emma had remained silent throughout. The exchange, watching not just Harrison but the reactions of the townspeople. Some nodded at his denials, clearly unwilling to believe the worst about the promised source of prosperity. Others looked troubled, the accumulated testimonies raising doubts about the railroad's methods. She rose slowly, and the room quieted, attention shifting to the widow whose confrontation with Harrison had become local legend in just 24 hours. Mr. Harrison, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent room. When you visited my farm yesterday, you were accompanied by Luke Cordell, a man wanted for murder in Colorado and Wyoming. A man who has killed at least 3 people who refuse to sell their land to railroad interests. Harrison's face betrayed nothing, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped the podium. Mrs. Blackwood, I believe you're mistaken about the identity of... I am not mistaken, Emma interrupted, her tone leaving no room for doubt. My late husband served with the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters during the war. Afterward, he tracked fugitives for the Pinkerton Agency for 2 years before we moved west. He maintained connections with law enforcement across the territories and kept detailed records of wanted criminals. This was a calculated embellishment. Robert had indeed served as a sharpshooter, but had never worked for the Pinkertons. Emma needed to establish a plausible explanation for her knowledge of Cordell, without revealing Marshal Walsh's presence. The man with the facial scar who accompanied you to my farm is Luke Cordell, she continued. A hired killer who has worked for railroad interests in 3 territories. His presence on your payroll speaks volumes about Northwestern's true methods. Harrison had recovered his composure, his smile now tinged with condescension. Mrs. Blackwood has obviously suffered greatly from her recent loss. Grief can sometimes lead people to see conspiracies where none exist. I assure you all, Northwestern employs only reputable security personnel. Sheriff Tanner rose at this point, clearly feeling the need to assert his authority. Now, folks, let's not get carried away with wild accusations. I've seen no evidence of criminal activity by railroad employees in my jurisdiction. Have you looked for any, Sheriff? This came from a new voice, Margaret Jenkins, whose family owned a large orchard south of town. When our irrigation channels were damaged last month, my husband reported it to your office. We're still waiting for someone to investigate. Tanner's face reddened. Mrs. Jenkins, my department has limited resources. We can't investigate every minor property dispute in the valley. It seems, Emma said, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs, that the sheriff finds time to investigate complaints against Northwestern's opponents, but not those made by them. Scattered nods and murmurs of agreement met this observation. Tanner started to respond, but Mayor Collins intervened, clearly eager to regain control of the meeting. "We're getting off track here," he said, forcing a jovial tone. "This gathering is about the railroad's benefits to Clearwater, not unsubstantiated allegations." "I have a question about those benefits," Emma said, refusing to be silenced. "Mr. Harrison claims Northwestern has purchased 70% of the needed right-of-way. Yet the published route requires my property and those of several others who have refused to sell. What happens to Clearwater's prosperity if you're preferred? A route becomes impossible to secure." Harrison's smile faltered slightly. This was the question he had hoped to avoid, the one that revealed how dependent Northwestern's plans were on acquiring specific properties like Emma's, with its critical access to both the creek and the flat grade needed for the rail line. "There are alternative routes being considered," he admitted reluctantly, "though they would be less efficient and potentially more costly to develop." "Less profitable, you mean?" Emma pressed. "And would these alternative routes still include a station centrally located in Clearwater, or would they bypass the town entirely?" A concerned murmur ran through the business owners present. Harrison hesitated just long enough to confirm their fears before recovering. "Northwestern remains committed to serving Clearwater," he said smoothly. "But I must be candid. The optimal route provides the greatest economic benefit to all parties. Alternative pathways might necessitate adjustments to planned station locations." This admission shifted the atmosphere in the room. Several merchants who had been vocally supportive of the railroad now looked troubled, recognizing that their anticipated prosperity depended on the very route being blocked by the holdout landowners. Mayor Collins attempted to redirect the conversation once more, but the meeting had already transformed from Harrison's planned showcase of railroad benefits into a public examination of Northwestern's tactics and contingency plans. As the discussion continued, Emma observed the subtle realignment of community sentiment. Not a complete reversal. Many still saw the railroad as essential to Clearwater's future, but enough doubt had been planted to weaken Harrison's position and strengthen the resolve of those opposing his methods. When the meeting finally concluded 2 hours later, Emma felt a cautious satisfaction. The public confrontation had accomplished what she'd hoped, exposing Northwestern's tactics to community scrutiny and forcing Harrison to acknowledge the importance of the contested properties to his plans. As the crowd dispersed, Sullivan leaned close to Emma. "Marshal Walsh wants to meet again tonight. Says he has new information about Harrison's timetable." Emma nodded slightly, aware that Harrison was watching her interactions from across the room. 9 o'clock, same arrangement," she murmured. Then louder for potential eavesdroppers, "I'll stop by tomorrow for those seed catalogues, Frank." Outside the schoolhouse, Emma found Noah Parker waiting with her horse. The boy's expression was animated, clearly excited by the tensions he'd witnessed inside. "Everyone's talking about how you stood up to Harrison and the sheriff, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, as he handed her the reins. "Even Mr. Wilson from the hardware store, and he's been all for the railroad since they first came to town." "Public opinion can be a powerful ally, Noah," Emma replied, mounting smoothly. "Or a dangerous enemy. Harrison will need to tread more carefully now that people are watching his methods with suspicion." They rode together toward her farm, taking a winding path that offered good visibility of the surrounding countryside. Emma had instructed Noah in the importance of varying routes, never establishing patterns that would make her movements predictable. "You think they'll still come after your place?" Noah asked, his voice lower despite there being no one within earshot. Emma's expression remained calm, but her eyes constantly scanned the landscape as they rode. "More determined than ever now. Harrison can't afford to let my defiance stand, especially after being challenged publicly. It would undermine his authority with both his employers and his hired men. But if people are suspicious of him now, it means he'll need to be more careful, more clever," Emma explained. "No more obvious tactics like barn burning. He'll look for subtler approaches, legal challenges perhaps, or more targeted forms of pressure. She glanced at the boy. Or he might decide that subtlety has failed and resort to overwhelming force, hoping to resolve the situation before federal authorities can intervene. Noah's youthful face grew serious. That's why you've been preparing the defensive positions. Precisely. Emma pointed to a ridge overlooking her property. Hawkins and his sons will take the high ground there if trouble comes. Sullivan has arranged for some of his allies from town to support us as well. Marshal Walsh is attempting to contact the nearest army post for assistance, though they're unlikely to arrive in time if Harrison decides to move quickly. They continued in thoughtful silence for several minutes before Noah spoke again. "Mrs. Blackwood, may I ask you something?" She nodded, her attention still divided between their conversation and vigilant observation of their surroundings. "Why did you and Mr. Blackwood never have children?" The question was asked with the direct simplicity of youth, without malice but heedless of potential sensitivity. Emma's expression softened slightly, memories surfacing that she usually kept carefully contained. "We tried," she said after a moment, "for several years. It wasn't to be." What she didn't share was the full truth. The 3 miscarriages, the growing understanding that something within her had been damaged, perhaps by the childhood illness that had nearly claimed her life at 12. The gradual acceptance that the family she and Robert had dreamed of would never materialize. "I'm sorry," Noah said, genuine regret in his voice. "Shouldn't have asked such a personal question." "It's all right," Emma assured him. "Life rarely follows the paths we plan for. Robert and I found happiness together, even without children, and now I find myself teaching you much, as my father taught me. Life has its own patterns, different from what we imagine, but meaningful nonetheless." As they crested the final hill, overlooking her farm, Emma reined in her horse, scanning the property carefully before proceeding. Nothing appeared disturbed. The house stood peaceful in the afternoon light, the burned barn a stark reminder of what had already been lost, the fields spreading golden toward the creek that marked her eastern boundary. "I'll need you to stay, alert while I meet with Marshal Walsh tonight," she told Noah as they approached the house. "Keep watch from the north ridge. If you see riders approaching from any direction, fire 2 shots in quick succession, then retreat to the reinforced storm cellar we prepared. Remember, don't engage unless cornered. Prioritize warning over confrontation," Noah recited, showing he'd absorbed her tactical instructions. "I remember, Mrs. Blackwood." Emma nodded approval. "Good. Now let's check the defensive positions. Once more before dusk. Harrison will have informants watching our movements. I want them to report that we're preparing, but not the specifics of how or where." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Emma felt the familiar clarity that came with imminent conflict. Harrison had been forced to reveal more of his plan than he'd intended at the town meeting. The 30-day deadline, the admission that alternative routes were less desirable, these were valuable pieces of intelligence that shaped her understanding of his likely next moves. Tonight's meeting with Marshal Walsh might provide additional insights, but regardless of what new information emerged, Emma knew that Clearwater Valley was approaching a decisive moment. Harrison could not afford to fail in his acquisition mission, not with Northwestern's larger expansion plans dependent on this critical link, and Emma would not, surrender the land that represented both her livelihood and her final connection to Robert. The confrontation had moved beyond a simple property dispute to something more fundamental, a test of whether corporate power, backed by hired guns and corrupted officials, could override individual rights and community interests. Emma had not sought this fight, but having found herself at its center, she was determined to see it through. As darkness settled over the valley, she completed her final preparations for the journey into town, checking her revolvers and securing additional ammunition in her saddlebags. Whatever Harrison planned next, Emma Blackwood would be ready. Darkness had settled completely over Clearwater by the time Emma approached the rear entrance to Sullivan's general store. She had taken a circuitous route into town, avoiding the main road and keeping to shadows. Her Remington revolvers rode at her hips beneath her long coat. A Derringer was tucked into a hidden pocket, and a shortened Winchester rifle was secured in a specially designed scabbard that Robert had crafted years ago, allowing for quick access. While remaining inconspicuous on horseback, the town was unusually active for this hour. Through gaps between buildings, Emma could see increased foot traffic on the main street, railroad workers and hired guns mingling with locals at the saloon, their loud voices carrying on the night air. Harrison was making a show of force, ensuring the community saw his resources and manpower. Emma dismounted in the narrow alley behind Sullivan's store, securing her horse out of sight. She knocked softly on the back door. 3 quick taps. Pause. 2 more, the signal arranged earlier with Sullivan. The door opened immediately, the storekeeper ushering her inside without a word. Upstairs, Marshal Walsh was not alone. A lean, weathered man with iron-grey hair stood examining the maps spread across Walsh's makeshift desk. He turned as Emma entered, his sharp eyes assessing her with professional interest. "Mrs. Blackwood," Walsh greeted her. "This is Richard Thornton, formerly of the Pinkerton Agency, now a private investigator I've worked with on several cases. He arrived this afternoon from Helena." Thornton extended a hand, which Emma shook with measured firmness. "Ma'am, Daniel speaks highly of your situation and capabilities." "Mr. Thornton has specialized in railroad cases for several years," Walsh explained. "He's been tracking Northwestern's expansion tactics across the territories, building evidence for both criminal prosecutions and civil litigation." Emma assessed the newcomer carefully. "You're the reinforcement Marshal Walsh was hoping for, one investigator." Thornton's weathered face creased in a brief smile. "One of several resources being deployed, Mrs. Blackwood. Though I understand your skepticism, my role is intelligence gathering, not firepower." "Richard has information we need," Walsh interjected, gesturing to the documents spread on the table. "Northwestern's operations in Clearwater follow patterns he's documented elsewhere, but with some concerning variations." Thornton nodded, turning back to the maps. "Harrison typically operates with more subtlety, gradual escalation, maintaining plausible deniability between Northwestern's official representatives and the intimidation tactics employed against holdouts." He indicated a timeline he'd constructed, showing Northwestern's expansion through 3 territories. In previous campaigns, Harrison allowed 3 to 6 months for land acquisition before construction deadlines. Here, he's compressed that timeline dramatically. 30 days is unprecedented. Emma processed this information, suggesting pressure from his superiors or external factors we're not aware of. "Precisely." Thornton pulled out a telegram form. This communication was sent from Northwestern's headquarters in Chicago to Harrison 3 days ago. A contact at the telegraph office provided a copy. Emma read the terse message: "Clearwater acquisition. Critical to Eastern financing. Stop, secure all parcels by month end. Stop, board authorization for extraordinary measures confirmed. Stop extraordinary measures," she echoed, looking up at the 2 men. "Corporate language for whatever it takes." Walsh nodded grimly. "Richard believes, and I concur, that Harrison is operating under unusual pressure. The company's Eastern investors have made the Clearwater route a condition of their continued financial support." Sullivan, who had been listening silently, cleared his throat. "That explains the increased manpower. 4 more gunmen arrived on today's stage, besides Mr. Thornton here. They went straight to the saloon, where Harrison was waiting." Emma's tactical mind immediately began recalculating probabilities. How many men does Harrison have now? By my count, 17 confirmed, Thornton answered. Cordell's original crew, plus these new arrivals, all experienced guns. From what I can determine, more than simple intimidation would require. He's preparing for something decisive, Emma concluded. The town meeting didn't go as he planned. Public opinion is shifting, making his usual methods more difficult to employ without consequences. Walsh tugged thoughtfully at his beard. There's something else you should know. I've received word that my request for federal enforcement support has been delayed. Emma's eyes narrowed. Delayed how? My superior in Helena telegraphed that the marshals I requested have been reassigned to a bank robbery case in Dakota Territory. He regrets that no additional federal personnel can be spared for what he terms a property dispute at this time. The implications were clear. Northwestern has influence in the federal marshal's office. Influence is a polite term for what appears to be happening, Walsh replied, his frustration evident. I've operated with official sanction thus far, but largely independently. This is the first direct interference I've encountered. Thornton leaned against the desk, arms crossed. It fits the pattern. Northwestern employs former government officials as consultants, men with connections in territorial administration, courts, and law enforcement. When necessary, these connections are leveraged to impede investigations or legal proceedings against the company. Emma absorbed this unwelcome development. So we cannot count on official support. Not within the time frame Harrison appears to be working under, Walsh confirmed. I've sent appeals to other contacts, but we must proceed on the assumption that we're on our own for the immediate future. Sullivan, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, moved to the window overlooking the main street. There's something else, he said, his voice low. Sheriff Tanner was seen entering the bank after hours this evening, meeting with Mayor Collins and Harrison. They were there nearly an hour. Emma joined him at the window, though she stayed carefully to the side to avoid being silhouetted. The main street of Clearwater stretched below, lamplight spilling from the saloon where Harrison's men had gathered in force. Harrison is consolidating local authority, she observed, ensuring the sheriff and mayor remain firmly in his camp after the challenges raised at the town meeting. More concerning is what they might be planning under color of law, Walsh added. With the sheriff's cooperation, Harrison could manufacture legal pretexts for action against the holdout properties. Emma turned back to the room, her decision made. Then we need to anticipate and counter whatever he's planning. Mr. Thornton, your expertise in Harrison's methods is valuable. What do you believe is his most likely next move? Thornton considered the question with professional detachment. Based on patterns established elsewhere and the compressed timeline he's working under, I see 3 possibilities. He ticked them off on his fingers. First, legal maneuvering, challenging property titles, water rights, or boundary surveys. Creates delays, but doesn't achieve quick results, making it less likely given his deadline. Second, escalated intimidation, not just property damage, but direct threats against holdout landowners themselves. Effectiveness varies depending on the individuals targeted. Third, and most concerning given the number of gunmen he's assembled, Yadu forced eviction under some manufactured legal pretext, probably claiming territorial authority for railroad right-of-way seizure. Emma nodded, having reached similar conclusions. The third option aligns with his deadline constraints, a coordinated action against multiple properties simultaneously, overwhelming resistance before federal authorities could intervene, even if they were inclined to do so. Which properties would be targeted first? Sullivan asked. Emma studied the map of Clearwater Valley with its marked holdout parcels. Mine would be primary. It's the most critical for their planned route. But Harrison would need to neutralize all significant opposition simultaneously to prevent organized resistance. She indicated the properties belonging to Hawkins, the Jenkins family, and several others who had refused Northwestern's offers. 7 key parcels spread across the valley. Too many to hit at once, even with 17 men. Thornton leaned over. The map, his investigator's eye noting patterns. Harrison typically prioritizes based on strategic value and perceived vulnerability. Your property, Mrs. Blackwood, is of highest value, but now recognized as well defended. The Jenkins orchard is similarly valuable due to its water access, and they have 3 grown sons known to be armed. His finger moved to Hawkins' farm. Hawkins presents multiple defenders but more isolated. These smaller holdings, he indicated 2 farms on the valley's western edge, offer less strategic resistance and could be secured quickly, allowing Harrison to concentrate forces for the more difficult targets. Emma's tactical mind processed these assessments, weighing them against her knowledge of the terrain and local resources. We need to consolidate our defenses. Isolated properties are vulnerable. If Harrison plans a coordinated operation, our only advantage lies in mutual support. Walsh nodded agreement. I've been thinking the same. My legal authority may be limited by Northwestern's political influence, but I still carry federal credentials. Harrison would hesitate to move openly against a known U.S. Marshal, unless he arranges to have your authority questioned or temporarily suspended, Emma pointed out. Northwestern's influence in the Marshal's office could be leveraged for that purpose. Thornton's expression confirmed her concern. It's happened before. Territorial officials declaring a Marshal's presence unauthorized or outside jurisdiction, long enough for corporate interests to accomplish their objectives. Emma made her decision. We need a defensible central position where holdout families can gather. My property offers the best tactical advantages, clear sightlines, natural barriers along the creek, high ground for observation posts. A collective defense, Sullivan mused. Harder for Harrison to claim legal pretext if he's facing a community response rather than isolated landowners. And much more difficult to overwhelm with his limited manpower, Emma added. Even 17 experienced gunmen would hesitate against a well-positioned force of determined defenders. Walsh studied the map, considering the logistics. How quickly could the families relocate, given proper motivation, by tomorrow evening? Sullivan answered. I can arrange wagons for those without their own transportation. Emma shook her head. Not quickly enough. Based on the intelligence we've gathered and Harrison's deadline pressures, I believe he'll move within 24 hours, possibly as soon as tomorrow morning. The others absorbed this assessment in grim silence, recognizing both its logic and implications. Then we need to warn them tonight, Sullivan said finally. Get word to Hawkins, the Jenkins family, and the others. Immediately, Emma nodded. Hawkins first. His sons can help spread the warning to the outlying properties while we focus on preparations at my farm. She turned to Thornton. Can you continue monitoring Harrison's movements here in town? Any advance warning of their departure or unusual activity would be invaluable. The investigator nodded. I've established a position at the boarding house across from the saloon, good visibility of their headquarters, and I have an arrangement with the telegraph operator to alert me to any messages Harrison sends or receives. I'll coordinate with Sullivan on evacuating the families, Walsh decided. My presence may help overcome hesitation, especially among those who might doubt the immediacy of the threat. As they finalized details, a soft knock at the door interrupted. They're planning. Sullivan moved cautiously to answer it, hand dropping to the revolver at his waist. He opened the door a crack, then relaxed. It's Noah, he said, stepping back to admit the boy. Noah Parker entered, his young face tense with urgency. He'd clearly ridden hard to town, his clothes dusty and his breathing still uneven. "Mrs. Blackwood," he gasped. "Riders on the North Road. At least a dozen, moving fast toward your property. I spotted them from the ridge while keeping watch." Emma's reaction was immediate. "Harrison's moving already, ahead of our expectations." She turned to the others. "He's divided his forces, keeping some men visible in town while sending others to secure my property under cover of darkness." "A smart, tactical move," Thornton acknowledged, "neutralizing the most defensible position before consolidating forces for the remaining targets." Emma was already moving toward the door, checking her weapons. "Noah, did you see who was leading them? Cordell?" The boy shook his head. "Too dark to make out faces, but they were carrying torches and—" He hesitated. "Sheriff Tanner was riding with them. I recognized his horse." This confirmed Emma's suspicions about local law enforcement's complicity. Harrison's securing official cover for whatever they're planning. Tanner's presence makes it an authorized action rather than private intimidation. Walsh's expression hardened. "Perversion of legal authority. I've seen it before." Emma addressed the group with calm urgency. "Noah and I will return to the farm immediately, taking the creek route to avoid the North Road. Marshall, can you and Sullivan still warn Hawkins and the others?" Walsh nodded. "We'll leave immediately. Hawkins can send his sons to alert the Jenkins family and the others. Mr. Thornton, maintain your position here in town," Emma continued. "Keep track of Harrison's remaining men. If they move out to join the first group, we need to know." As they prepared to separate, Sullivan grabbed Emma's arm. "You can't fight a dozen men alone, Emma, even with Noah's help. Wait for reinforcements." Emma's expression remained resolute. "I don't intend to engage them directly, but I need to reach my property before they secure it completely. Robert's workshop contains not just weapons, but documents, designs, client records, personal journals. I can't let those fall into Harrison's hands." She didn't mention her other motivation, the defensive preparations already established around her property, which would be far more effective if she could reach them before Tanner's party arrived in force. Walsh intervened. "She's right, Frank. The tactical advantage of reaching her property first outweighs the risk. And remember what Harrison doesn't know, that Emma Blackwood is not merely a skilled markswoman, but trained in her father's strategic principles." Sullivan, reluctantly, conceded the point. "At least take these," he said, retrieving a box of ammunition from a cabinet. "Winchester repeater cartridges, compatible with that modified rifle of yours." Emma accepted them with a nod of thanks, securing the additional ammunition in her coat pocket. "We'll meet at my property, the East Ridge defensive position. We established yesterday, by dawn if possible." As she and Noah slipped out the back door into the darkness, Emma's mind was already shifting into the tactical clarity her father had instilled in her, analyzing options, calculating probabilities, preparing contingencies. Harrison had moved more quickly than anticipated, but not in a way she hadn't considered as possible. The game had changed, but Emma Blackwood had spent a lifetime preparing for battles she hoped would never come. Now that one had arrived, she found herself ready, not eager for violence, but unflinching in her determination to defend what was hers. They mounted quickly, Emma leading the way into the shadows between buildings, avoiding the lamplight from the main street. As they reached the edge of town, she guided her horse toward the creek that would eventually lead them to her property. "We'll follow the water line," she instructed Noah in a low voice. "The banks will mask our movement, and the water will cover the sound of the horses. Stay close, keep low in the saddle." The boy nodded, his young face set with determination despite the fear evident in his eyes. Emma felt a surge of pride in his courage, followed by concern for his safety. Noah was barely 17, untested in genuine conflict despite his enthusiasm for her training exercises. She had not intended to draw him into actual danger. "Noah," she said as they rode, "when we reach the farm, I need you to do something specific The reinforced storm cellar we prepared, there's a hidden compartment in the north wall. Inside are some of Robert's most important documents. I need you to secure those papers while I deal with Tanner and his men." The boy straightened. "I can fight, Mrs. Blackwood. You've been training me." "This task is more important than fighting," Emma replied firmly. "Those documents represent Robert's life work. They cannot fall into Northwestern's hands, no matter what happens." She didn't add that this assignment would also keep Noah away from the direct confrontation she anticipated. Some lessons, the hardest ones about combat and its consequences, were better left unlearned by one so young, if possible. They rode in silence for several minutes. The only sounds the soft splashing of hooves in shallow water, and the night. Creatures that inhabited the creek banks. The quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate while still affording the concealment of deep shadows. Emma's thoughts turned to the immediate challenges ahead. Sheriff Tanner's presence complicated matters. Any resistance could be construed as opposing lawful authority rather than defending private property. She needed to understand what legal pretext they were operating under before determining her response. As they rounded a bend in the creek, Emma reined in suddenly, raising a hand for Noah to halt. Ahead, where the creek passed close to the main road, torchlight flickered between the trees. Voices carried on the night air, men dispatched from the main group to secure the water approaches to her property. Emma signaled Noah to dismount and secure the horses. They proceeded on foot, moving silently along the creek bank until they could observe without being detected. 3 riders had paused at the road crossing, torches illuminating their features. Emma recognized 2 of Harrison's men from the confrontation at her farm. The third was Deputy Collins, the sheriff's younger brother and most loyal subordinate. Waste of time," one of Harrison's men was saying. "No one's gonna approach from the creek at night." Deputy Collins shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Sheriff's orders. We secure all approaches while they serve the eviction papers at the D.D. main house." Emma's eyes narrowed at this information. Eviction papers, the legal pretext she had anticipated. Harrison had convinced Tanner to manufacture some official documentation, declaring her presence on the property unauthorized or illegal. "Might as well get comfortable," the deputy continued, dismounting. "We'll be here till morning or until we get word they've secured the place." Emma drew back silently, gesturing for Noah to follow. When they were safely out of earshot, she whispered, "They've divided their forces to cover multiple approaches. That works to our advantage. Smaller groups are easier to bypass or neutralize if necessary." "What do we do now?" Noah asked, his voice barely audible. Emma considered their options. The main force, including Sheriff Tanner, was already at her farm serving fabricated eviction papers. These 3 men were blocking the creek approach. Other groups were likely positioned to cover additional routes. "We need to reach the farm without alerting these sentries," she decided. "There's a deer trail half a mile east that cuts through the woods. It's too narrow for horses, but we can proceed on foot." They retreated to where they'd left their mounts, securing them in a well-concealed thicket with access to water. Emma removed essential supplies from her saddlebags, including additional ammunition and a small field glass Robert had modified for night observation. "From here on, absolute silence," she instructed Noah. "Follow exactly in my footsteps, stay low, and freeze in place if I signal." As they moved eastward through the darkness, Emma's senses were heightened to their fullest acuity, watching for movement, listening for unnatural sounds, constantly evaluating their surroundings. Her father had trained her extensively in night operations, emphasizing that darkness could be an ally more valuable than any weapon. The distant glow of torches marked their destination, her farm, now occupied by Harrison's men operating under Sheriff Tanner's dubious authority. Emma felt a cold determination settling over her. They had invaded her home, threatened her livelihood, and corrupted local law to serve corporate interests. Whatever came next, Emma Blackwood would ensure they regretted that decision profoundly. A narrow deer trail wound through dense pine forest that bordered the eastern edge of Emma's property. She moved with practiced silence, each step carefully placed to avoid dry twigs or loose stones. Noah followed close behind, doing his best to mimic her movements, though lacking her years of training in woodland stealth. After 20 minutes of cautious progress, the trees began to thin. Emma paused, raising a hand for Noah to stop. Ahead, the forest gave way to the east pasture of her farm. Through breaks in the tree line, torchlight was visible around her farmhouse, some 400 yards distant. Emma removed Robert's modified field glass from her coat pocket. The device was a marvel of his ingenuity, compact enough to carry easily, with specialized lenses that gathered available moonlight to enhance vision in darkness. She surveyed her property methodically, assessing the situation with tactical precision. Sheriff Tanner and 4 men stood on her front porch. The door was open, suggesting they had already entered and searched the house. Additional figures moved around the property. She counted at least 8 men besides those on the porch, patrolling in pairs. 2 were examining the burned remains of her barn, while others checked the stable and storage sheds. Most concerning was the activity near the root cellar door. 3 men with lanterns were emerging from below ground, one of them gesturing excitedly. To Tanner on the porch, they had discovered Robert's workshop. Emma's jaw tightened. The workshop contained not just weapons and ammunition, but detailed designs, client records, and personal journals documenting decades of firearms innovation. In the wrong hands, that knowledge could be exploited, or worse, lost forever. She passed the field glass to Noah. "They've found the workshop," she whispered. "We need to move quickly but cautiously." The boy studied the scene, his expression hardening at the sight of intruders ransacking Emma's home. "There's so many of them," he murmured. "What's the plan?" Emma indicated a point to their right, where the tree line curved closer to the rear of her property. "We'll approach through the eastern woods to the storm cellar. They seem focused on the main workshop. They may not have discovered the storm cellar's hidden compartment yet." They withdrew deeper into the forest, circling toward the position Emma had indicated. As they moved, she continued assessing options. Direct confrontation was impossible against so many armed men operating under the sheriff's authority, however dubious. Her advantage lay in superior knowledge of the terrain and the defensive preparations she'd already established around the property. The storm cellar was separate from the root cellar that connected to Robert's workshop, located behind the house near the kitchen garden. Originally built as a refuge from prairie tornadoes, Emma and Robert had reinforced it to serve as a secure storage location for their most sensitive documents and valuable prototypes. As they neared the edge of the woods closest to the garden, Emma observed the area carefully. 2 of Harrison's men were positioned nearby, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices while ostensibly patrolling the rear of the property. "They're too close to the cellar entrance," Noah whispered. "We can't reach it without being seen." "We don't need to reach it yet," Emma replied softly. "First, we need to create a distraction that will draw attention away from this area." She studied the property layout, considering options. The stable at the northwestern corner was far enough from the house that a commotion there would draw men away without immediately endangering the storm cellar area. "Noah, do you remember the defensive position we established behind the stone wall at the north pasture?" When he nodded, she continued, "There's a box of signal flares hidden in the hollow oak tree 20 paces behind it. I need you to retrieve 1 flare and light it near the stable. The sudden light and smoke will draw their attention." The boy's eyes widened at the responsibility. "Then what?" "Return immediately to the stone wall position and wait. Don't engage with them, no matter what happens. When most of the men have Move to investigate. I'll access the storm cellar. Once I've secured the documents, I'll fire a single shot. That's your signal to retreat to the creek where we left the horses. Noah nodded solemnly. I understand. But what about you? Emma's expression was calm but determined. I'll have what I came for, and I'll have activated certain preparations around the property. Trust that I have a plan for extraction. She didn't elaborate further. The fewer details Noah knew, the less danger to him if he were captured. The boy was brave but untested in true combat situations. Be careful, she told him. These men won't hesitate to shoot if they see you. Speed and stealth are your allies. Noah swallowed hard but squared his shoulders. I won't let you down, Mrs. Blackwood. They separated, Noah moving silently along the tree line toward the north pasture, while Emma remained in position, watching. The men patrolling near the storm cellar. Minutes passed in tense silence as she divided her attention between Noah's progress and the movements of Harrison's men. A sudden flare of brilliant red light erupted near the stable, accompanied by a sharp hissing sound as the signal flare ignited. The effect was immediate. Shouts of alarm rang out from around the property as men turned toward the unexpected illumination. Fire! The stable's on fire! Someone called out, misinterpreting the flare's smoke and brightness. Sheriff Tanner's voice cut through the commotion. Jenkins, Rodriguez, check it out. The rest of you stay at your posts. Not as many men responded as Emma had hoped. Only 3 figures ran toward the stable, leaving the majority still scattered around the house and workshop. Tanner was being cautious, suspecting a potential diversion. Emma adjusted her plan. The distraction had drawn some attention, but not enough to safely approach the storm cellar. She needed a secondary diversion, more compelling than the first. Reaching into her coat pocket, she withdrew a small object Robert had designed years ago, a mechanical timer attached to a compact percussion cap detonator. Setting it for a 30-second delay, she attached it to one of the extra rifle cartridges Sullivan had provided, then carefully aimed and threw the assembly toward the chicken coop at the far eastern edge of the property. When the timer triggered, the resulting explosion was far louder than a normal rifle shot, resonating across the property with an echoing crack. The chickens erupted in panicked squawking, adding to the chaos. This second distraction proved more effective. Several more men ran toward the sound, including one of the guards near the storm cellar. Only one remained, nervously scanning the darkness, his rifle raised. Emma didn't hesitate. Drawing her Remington with practiced fluidity, she aimed carefully and fired a single shot. The guard's lantern shattered, plunging his position into darkness. Before he could react or call out, Emma was moving, covering the 30 yards to the storm cellar entrance in seconds. She reached the heavy wooden doors. Without encountering resistance, the remaining guard having moved away from his position to investigate the sudden darkness. Using a key from her pocket, Emma unlocked the padlock securing the cellar doors and slipped inside, closing them silently behind her. The storm cellar was pitch black, but Emma knew its layout intimately. Moving with confidence despite the darkness, she reached the north wall, feeling along the rough stone until she located the hidden catch that released a section of the wall. Behind it lay a small compartment containing a waterproof metal case. Emma removed the case quickly, checking its contents by touch. The documents were all there, along with several small objects wrapped in oilcloth. She secured the case under her arm and was about to exit when she heard voices directly outside the cellar doors. "Check down here," came Sheriff Tanner's voice. "Could be she's hiding underground." Emma froze, calculating options. The cellar had no other exit, and she would be trapped if they entered now. Her hand moved to her remaining Remington, but she had no desire to shoot the sheriff if it could be avoided. Such an action would only validate Harrison's narrative and turn the community against her cause. Instead, she retreated to the hidden compartment, which was just large enough for a person if they crouched uncomfortably. She slipped inside, pulling the false wall closed as the cellar doors creaked open above. Lantern light spilled down the stairs as two sets of boots descended into the cellar. Through a tiny observation crack built into the false wall, Emma could see Sheriff Tanner and Deputy Collins searching the small space. "Nothing here, Sheriff," Collins reported after a cursory inspection. "Just some preserved food and storm supplies." Tanner seemed unsatisfied, studying the cellar with suspicion. "Something's not right. 2 diversions in quick succession. That's tactical thinking, not random trouble." Emma held perfectly still, barely breathing as the sheriff moved closer to her hiding place. His hand actually brushed the false wall as he examined the cellar's construction. "Sheriff!" A shout from outside interrupted his investigation. "We found something in the workshop you need to see." Tanner hesitated, then turned away. "Coming!" He gave the cellar one last suspicious look before ascending the stairs, Deputy Collins following close behind. Emma waited several long minutes before emerging from her hiding place, ears straining for any sound of return. When she was confident, they had moved away. She crept up the stairs and peered cautiously out of the cellar doors. The 2 diversions had served their purpose, drawing attention away from her immediate vicinity. Most of Harrison's men were now concentrated around the workshop entrance, examining whatever they had discovered there. Moving silently, Emma skirted the edge of her property, keeping to shadows and using outbuildings for cover. She needed to reach the north pasture stone wall to signal Noah, then make her way to the creek rendezvous point. As she passed near the workshop entrance, fragments of conversation reached her. Military-grade modifications. "These designs are worth a fortune. Harrison will want all of this documented." They were cataloging Robert's work, recognizing its value. Emma felt a surge of cold anger. These men were not just invading her property under false pretenses. They were preparing to steal her husband's life work and intellectual property. She continued her careful movement toward the north pasture, reaching the stone wall without incident. A flash of movement caught her eye. Noah, concealed behind the wall exactly where she had instructed him to be. The boy had performed his task perfectly. Emma raised her Remington and fired a single shot into the air, the signal for Noah to retreat to the rendezvous point. Immediately, shouts erupted from around the farmhouse as Harrison's men reacted to the gunfire. "There, by the north wall." "It's her, the widow! Spread out! Don't let her escape!" Emma holstered her weapon and ran, not toward the creek where Noah was headed, but toward the rocky ridge that marked her property's northern boundary. This was deliberate, drawing pursuit away from Noah's escape route while leading Harrison's men into territory she had carefully prepared. Behind her, she could hear men crashing through underbrush, their movements lacking the woodland stealth Emma had practiced since childhood. She maintained her pace, neither so fast that she lost them entirely, nor so slow that they could close the distance. When she reached the ridge, Emma paused momentarily to ensure her pursuers saw which direction she took, then continued along, a narrow trail that wound between massive granite boulders. This area had been one of the first she had prepared for potential conflict, a natural labyrinth enhanced with subtle modifications. As she heard the first men enter the boulder field, behind her, Emma permitted herself a grim smile. They were now in her carefully crafted defensive position, where visibility was limited, footing was treacherous, and several unpleasant surprises awaited the unwary. She ducked behind a large boulder, watching as 3 of Harrison's men entered. The labyrinth. They moved with the confidence of experienced gunmen, but their unfamiliarity with the terrain was obvious. "Spread out," one directed. "She's on foot. She can't have gone far." Emma waited until they separated, then reached down to a nearly invisible wire stretched across the path. With a sharp tug, she activated the first of Robert's defensive innovations, a deadfall of heavy logs, previously secured above the path, released with a thunderous crash, missing the men but effectively blocking their easiest route of pursuit. Simultaneously, several small charges placed among the rocks detonated, creating a cacophony of sound that echoed through the boulder field like gunfire. The men reacted predictably, diving for cover and firing blindly toward the perceived threat. Confusion turned to chaos as the echoing shots and falling rocks created the impression of multiple attackers. Emma used this confusion to slip away, moving deeper into the labyrinth along a route she had memorized. Behind her, more of Harrison's men were arriving, drawn by the commotion. "What the hell is happening? An ambush! She's not alone! Spread out and find cover!" By this point, Emma had reached a vantage point overlooking the entire boulder field. From here, she could observe without being seen, watching as Harrison's men blundered into additional traps. Tripwires that triggered noisemakers, unstable rocks that shifted underfoot, narrow passages that forced them to proceed single file into vulnerable positions. No trap was lethal. Emma had designed them to confuse and delay, not to kill. But to men unfamiliar with the terrain, in darkness, under the impression they were being fired upon from multiple directions, the effect was profoundly disorienting. Emma allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before continuing toward her extraction. In point. Her father had always emphasized that superior tactical positioning could overcome numerical disadvantage. Tonight was proving him correct. She worked her way down the far side of the ridge, hearing the continuing chaos behind her. By now, most of Harrison's men had been drawn into the boulder field, leaving the farmhouse less heavily guarded. This had been her secondary objective, not just to escape with the vital documents, but to pull Harrison's forces away from her, at property, dispersing them into unfavorable terrain while she regrouped with her allies. Emma reached level ground and increased her pace, moving through the darkness with confidence born of intimate familiarity with the land. Her destination was a bend in the creek a half-mile beyond, where she had left Noah with the horses, a location she had established as an emergency rendezvous point. As she approached, Emma heard soft voices ahead. Drawing her Remington, she advanced cautiously until she could make out figures in the darkness, Noah as expected, but also others. She recognized Caleb Hawkins and his 3 sons, along with Marshall Walsh and Frank Sullivan. "Mrs. Blackwood," Noah called out as she emerged from the shadows. "You made it. Did you get the documents?" Emma nodded, displaying the metal case briefly before securing it in her saddlebag, and created considerable confusion among Harrison's men in the process. "They'll be occupied in the boulder field for some time." Marshall Walsh stepped forward. "Sullivan and I reached Hawkins' place just as Harrison's second group of men arrived. They had fraudulent eviction notices, similar to those served at your property. We were ready for them," Hawkins added with grim satisfaction. "My boys had warning positions established, fired a few shots over their heads when they tried to approach the house. They retreated to regroup, which gave us time to gather essentials and leave." "The Jenkins family?" Emma asked. "Safe," Sullivan confirmed. "Hawkins' youngest son warned them in time. They've gone to the meeting point we established at Clearwater Cave." Emma nodded approval. Clearwater Cave was an excellent defensive position. A natural limestone formation with multiple chambers and limited approaches, located in the hills above the valley. They had identified it as a potential fallback position during earlier planning. "What about Peterson and the others?" she asked. Hawkins' expression darkened. "Peterson surrendered his property without resistance. Can't blame him. His wife's been ailing, and he has young children to consider. Tucker is holding out at his place, but he's alone. The Wilkins brothers were away delivering cattle when Harrison's men arrived. No word on their situation." Emma processed this information quickly. The holdouts had been reduced to those currently present, the Jenkins family, and possibly Tucker and the Wilkins brothers, perhaps 20 people total, including women and children, against Harrison's 17 hired guns, plus whatever local support Sheriff Tanner could muster. Harrison's moved faster than we anticipated, Walsh observed. These coordinated nighttime evictions with the sheriff's participation indicate he's abandoned any pretense of legal process. He's gambling that he can present Northwestern with accomplished facts before legitimate authorities can intervene, which means our time frame for response is equally compressed, Emma concluded. By morning, he'll have realized his men have been lured into a trap at my property. He'll consolidate his forces and move against our remaining strongholds. Sullivan looked troubled. We're outnumbered and outgunned. Even with your skills and preparations, Mrs. Blackwood, direct confrontation seems inadvisable. Direct confrontation was never my intention, Emma replied calmly. My father taught me that superior position and strategy can overcome numerical disadvantage, but only a fool seeks combat when alternatives exist. She turned to Marshal Walsh. You said federal reinforcement is blocked through official channels. What about unofficial ones? Walsh exchanged glances with Sullivan before answering. There might be an option. When I realized Northwestern was interfering with my communication through the marshal's office, I sent a private telegram to an old colleague, Captain Michael Reeves of the 7th Cavalry. His company is patrolling the Northern Territory border, perhaps 3 days' ride from here. Military intervention would certainly change the equation, Emma acknowledged, but we need to hold out until they can arrive. Hawkins cleared his throat. There's something else you should know, Mrs. Blackwood. Word of your stand against Harrison has spread beyond Clearwater. Farmers and ranchers from neighboring valleys have been arriving since nightfall, men who've faced similar tactics from Northwestern in their own communities. Emma's attention sharpened. How many? 15 when we left my place, Hawkins replied, more expected by morning. They've brought weapons, supplies, and considerable determination. Seems you've become something of a symbol of resistance. This was an unexpected development, but a welcome one. Additional defenders would significantly alter the tactical balance, especially if they were experienced frontiersmen familiar with the territory. Where are they gathering? She asked. Clearwater Cave, as agreed, Sullivan answered. Jenkins is organizing them. They're establishing defensive positions and distributing supplies. Emma considered this new information, her tactical mind assessing opportunities and challenges. The arrival of additional allies improved their defensive capabilities, but also increased the number of people depending on her leadership and strategy. Then we proceed as planned, she decided. We consolidate at Clearwater Cave, establish a defensible perimeter, and prepare for Harrison's next move. Marshal Walsh, send your message to Captain Reeves with urgency. If we can hold our position for 3 days, military intervention could resolve the situation without further bloodshed. Noah, who had been listening intently to the adults' conversation, spoke up. What about your farm, Mrs. Blackwood? And the workshop? All your husband's work? Emma's expression remained composed, though the question touched a painful truth. Buildings can be rebuilt, Noah. Land can be reclaimed. The most important elements of Robert's legacy are secure. She patted the saddlebag containing the metal case. His innovations, his designs, his journals, these represent his true life's work. The group mounted their horses, preparing to depart for Clearwater Cave. As they rode, Emma found herself riding alongside Marshal Walsh. You handled that boy's question with grace, he observed quietly. But I suspect the reality of potentially losing your home weighs more heavily than you let on. Emma was silent for a moment before responding. My father used to say that attachment to physical things is a vulnerability in conflict. What matters is the land itself and the principles we stand for in defending it. Wise words, Walsh acknowledged, though easier to accept in theory than in practice, I imagine. Indeed. Emma's gaze remained fixed on the trail ahead, but her Thoughts turned to the farmhouse that had been her home for 10 years, the workshop where Robert had spent countless hours perfecting his designs. The fields they had tended together, planning for a future that had been cut short by his death. Losing these things would be painful beyond measure. But her father had taught her another important lesson. In conflict, emotional attachment could be exploited by an enemy. Clear-headed strategy required acknowledging such attachments without being controlled by them. As they rode through the darkness toward Clearwater Cave, Emma focused her mind on the challenges ahead. Harrison had revealed his desperation through this night's actions, abandoning legal pretenses for naked force, risking community outrage and potential legal consequences. Such desperation made him dangerous, but also prone to mistakes. The coming confrontation would test not just Emma's marksmanship, but her strategic thinking, her leadership, and her ability to control the emotional terrain of conflict as effectively as the physical. For the first time since Harrison's men had burned her barn, she felt a sense of cautious optimism. The battle for Clearwater Valley was far from over, but Emma Blackwood, daughter of Franklin Deadeye Reynolds, was finally fighting on terms. Of her own choosing, Clearwater Cave rose from the hillside like a natural fortress, its limestone entrance partially concealed by pine trees and rocky outcroppings. Inside, the main chamber extended nearly 100 feet, with smaller adjoining passages branching into the hillside. Cool, dry air carried the earthy scent of mineral deposits formed over centuries. By dawn, the cave had transformed into an improvised command center. Lanterns illuminated the rough stone walls, casting long shadows as people moved about with purpose. Emma stood at a makeshift table where maps of Clearwater Valley had been spread out, Sullivan and Walsh on either side of her. 32 defenders, in total, Sullivan reported, concluding his census. 21 men with firearms, 4 women who can shoot, plus 7 children and elderly to protect. Emma nodded, mentally comparing this force to Harrison's resources. And our visitors from neighboring valleys? What's their experience? Mostly ranchers and farmers, Hawkins answered from across the table. Not soldiers, but men who've defended their properties against rustlers and outlaws. They know how to handle themselves. Footsteps echoed from the cave entrance as Jenkins's eldest son arrived, breathing hard from his run up the hillside. Riders approaching from town, he reported. Harrison himself leading them, with Sheriff Tanner and at least 15 men. Emma checked her pocket watch. Just past 7 in the morning, earlier than she had anticipated. Harrison had abandoned the night search of her property faster than expected, suggesting he had recognized the trap and adapted his strategy. "They're following our trail," Jenkins' son continued. "Found the tracks where we crossed Blackfoot Creek. They'll be at the base of the hill within half an hour." Emma studied the map, her mind calculating distances and positioning. "They'll approach from the south trail," she determined. "It's the only route practical for mounted men." "A single approach means we can concentrate our defenses," Hawkins observed, "but also leaves us without an escape route if we're overwhelmed," Walsh cautioned. Emma traced the contour lines on the map. "There's a hunter's path that leads northeast from the secondary cave entrance. Difficult terrain, but passable in an emergency. We should position the non-combatants near that exit with guides ready." She straightened, addressing the gathered defenders. "Harrison's force outnumbers our experienced fighters, but we have superior position and local knowledge. Our objective isn't to engage in prolonged combat, but to hold this position until federal authorities or military reinforcements arrive." "That telegram to Captain Reeves," Walsh added, "was dispatched by Sullivan's nephew at first light. He rode for the Winchester station directly, avoiding Clearwater entirely." Emma nodded approval. "Good. Now we need to establish defensive positions." She assigned teams to cover the main approach and potential secondary routes, positioning the most experienced marksmen at key vantage points. Hawkins and his sons would guard the cave entrance itself, while Jenkins and several others would occupy elevated positions among the rocks overlooking the trail. Emma herself, along with Noah and two of the visiting ranchers, would take the most forward position, a rocky outcropping that commanded the final approach to the cave. From there, they could observe Harrison's force while remaining protected by natural cover. "We don't initiate conflict," she instructed the defenders. "If Harrison comes to negotiate, we listen. If he comes to threaten, we stand firm. If he attacks..." She checked the Remington at her hip. "We defend ourselves with appropriate force." As the defenders moved to their assigned positions, Marshal Walsh approached Emma privately. "You've organized these people remarkably well," he observed. "Your father taught you more than just marksmanship. Franklin Reynolds believed tactics and strategy were more important than simple shooting skill," Emma replied. "He used to say that the cleverer fighter seldom needs to fire a shot. A philosophy I appreciate," Walsh said with a rueful smile, "though I suspect Harrison may not give us the luxury of a bloodless resolution." "Perhaps not," Emma acknowledged. "But every conflict has multiple potential outcomes. The true strategist creates options rather than accepting apparent inevitabilities." She moved to the cave entrance, surveying the valley below through Robert's field glass. The morning sun illuminated a landscape of extraordinary beauty. Rolling hills covered in autumn gold grass, stands of pine and aspen, the silver thread of Clearwater Creek winding through it all. This was what they were fighting for, not just individual properties, but the freedom to build lives in this place, without surrendering to corporate domination. "They're coming into view," Noah called softly from his observation point. Emma trained her field glass on the approaching riders. Harrison rode at the front beside Sheriff Tanner, both men looking grim and determined. Behind them came Cordell and the other hired guns, alert and heavily armed. Bringing up the rear was a wagon, an unexpected addition that immediately caught Emma's attention. "They've brought a wagon," she reported to Walsh. "Something heavy under canvas." The marshal's expression darkened. "I don't like that. Could be supplies for a prolonged siege, or something worse." Emma's tactical mind considered possibilities. "Explosives, perhaps. The cave would be vulnerable to blasting." "Or a Gatling gun," Walsh suggested grimly. "Northwestern has used them before to intimidate opponents in mining disputes." This possibility shifted Emma's assessment significantly. A Gatling gun could unleash devastating firepower against defenders in fixed positions. They needed to know what was in that wagon before finalizing their strategy. "Noah," she called quietly, "work your way down to that western outcropping. Use the field glass I gave you to get a better view of what's in that wagon." The boy nodded and moved out, staying low and using natural cover just as Emma had taught him. Harrison's party halted at the base of the hill, just beyond effective rifle range of the cave. After a brief consultation, Tanner and Harrison separated from the main group, riding forward with a white cloth tied to a stick, the universal signal for parley. "They want to talk," Walsh observed. "That's something. Or a distraction while..." "They position their men," Emma countered. "Hawkins, keep your sons watching their flanks. Make sure they don't try to circle around while we're occupied with Harrison." She stepped out from the cave entrance, standing where she would be clearly visible to the approaching men. Walsh moved to her side, his marshal's badge prominently displayed on his chest. Harrison and Tanner reined in their horses about 50 yards away. The railroad man's normally impeccable appearance had suffered from the night's activities. His suit was dusty, his face unshaven. Sheriff Tanner looked equally worn, with an additional hint of discomfort in his bearing. "Mrs. Blackwood," Harrison called out, his voice carrying up the hillside. "I see Marshal Walsh is with you." "Good. This can all be resolved legally without further unpleasantness." Emma made no move toward her weapons, but remained alert to any sign of treachery. "Illegally evicting landowners in the middle of the night seems rather unpleasant already, Mr. Harrison." as does falsifying legal documents and corrupting local officials. Those eviction notices were perfectly legitimate, Tanner insisted. Though his voice lacked conviction, Walsh stepped forward. I've examined copies of those documents, Sheriff. They lack proper territorial authorization and were issued without due process. Any judge would invalidate them immediately. Harrison waved a dismissive hand. Procedural details that can be corrected after the fact. The point is, Northwestern Railroad has legal authority for its right-of-way through Clearwater Valley. Resistance is not only futile, but counterproductive for all concerned. If your legal position is so strong, Emma replied, why resort to midnight raids, burned barns, and hired gunmen with criminal histories? Harrison's expression hardened. We face unnecessary delays from landowners refusing generous compensation. Northwestern's development schedule cannot accommodate such obstructionism. At that moment, Noah returned to Emma's side, breathing hard. From his scramble up the hillside, he leaned close, whispering urgently in her ear, It's a Gatling gun, Mrs. Blackwood. I saw them checking it when they pulled the canvas back, and they've got boxes of ammunition. Emma's face betrayed nothing, as she received this confirmation of their fears. A Gatling gun could fire hundreds of rounds per minute, turning the cave entrance into a death trap. Your corporate schedules are not our concern, Mr. Harrison, she called down, giving no indication of what she'd just learned. We have legal title to our lands and no obligation to sell at any price. Harrison's pretense of reasonableness slipped, revealing the frustration beneath. You leave me no choice but to enforce Northwestern's legal rights by whatever means necessary. He gestured back toward his men and the wagon. I've brought resources sufficient to resolve this standoff decisively. A Gatling gun against civilians. Defending their homes, Walsh called out, his voice carrying to the men waiting behind Harrison. Is that how the Northwestern Railroad conducts business? Through mass murder? Several of Harrison's men shifted uncomfortably at this naked description of what they were preparing to do. Even some of the hired guns exchanged uneasy glances. Harrison's face flushed with anger. These people are trespassing on railroad property. The territorial authority has granted us a right-of-way. Based on fraudulent filings and corrupted officials, Walsh countered, I've documented systematic bribery and intimidation across 3 territories, Mr. Harrison. Northwestern's entire land acquisition program rests on criminal foundations. Emma watched the exchange with outward calm. Though her mind was racing through tactical options, the Gatling gun changed everything. Their carefully prepared defensive positions would become death traps once that weapon was deployed. You have precisely 1 hour to vacate this position, Harrison announced, his composure recovered. After that, I cannot guarantee the safety of anyone remaining. He turned his horse, preparing to rejoin his men. Before you go, Mr. Harrison, Emma called out, you should know that complete documentation of Northwestern's activities in Clearwater Valley has been dispatched to federal authorities, territorial courts, and several major newspapers. Harrison paused, looking back with narrowed eyes. My late husband was meticulous about recording threats and suspicious activities, she continued. Marshal Walsh has affidavits from multiple landowners documenting your tactics. If anything happens to us here today, that evidence ensures Northwestern Railroad will face not just legal consequences, but public scandal that will devastate your stock value and Eastern financing. This was partially bluff. The documentation existed, but its dispatch to multiple authorities was still in progress. Nevertheless, Emma saw uncertainty flicker across Harrison's face. 1 hour, he repeated, though with less conviction. Then we act. As Harrison and Tanner rode back to their men, Walsh turned to Emma. A Gatling gun changes the equation significantly. This position becomes indefensible once they deploy it. Agreed, Emma replied. We need an alternative strategy. She surveyed their defensive setup with fresh eyes, seeking options that had not been apparent before. Sullivan joined them, having overheard the exchange. Could we surrender the cave but disperse into the hills? Make ourselves too difficult to track and eliminate? Emma shook her head. Harrison needs this resolved quickly. If we scatter, he'd likely take hostages from among those he could catch, women, children, the elderly, forcing the rest of us to surrender. Her gaze settled on the wagon containing the Gatling gun. We don't need to defend the cave, she said slowly. We need to neutralize their advantage. Walsh followed her line of thought. The Gatling gun. If we could disable it... Exactly. Emma's mind was already formulating a plan. It's their decisive edge. Without it, they're just men with rifles, still dangerous, but not overwhelmingly. So given our position, she quickly gathered the most experienced fighters, Hawkins, Jenkins, Sullivan, and 2 of the visiting ranchers with military experience. We need a targeted operation to neutralize that Gatling gun, she explained. A small team, moving quietly while the rest maintained defensive positions to prevent a frontal assault. It would have to be perfectly timed, Jenkins cautioned. Once they realize what we're doing, they'll bring everything they have against us. Emma nodded. That's why we need a diversion on the opposite flank, something to draw attention and resources away from the wagon. One of the visiting ranchers, a grey-haired man named Matthews, who had fought in the war, spoke up. Fire would do it. Those dry grasses on the eastern slope would burn fast and hot, set it in multiple places, make them think we're trying to circle behind them. Good. Emma turned to Noah. I need you to guide the non-combatants out through the back exit. Get them moving toward Wilkins' northern property. It's the furthest from Harrison's current operations. The boy's face fell. But I want to help. With the fight, Emma placed a firm hand on his shoulder. This is helping. Those people need someone who knows the terrain and can move quickly. I'm trusting you with their lives, Noah. The responsibility transformed his disappointment. He nodded solemnly. Yes, ma'am. I'll see them safely to Wilkins' place. As Noah departed to organize the evacuation, Emma finalized the details of their counter-offensive. Matthews and 2 others would create the fire diversion on the eastern slope. Hawkins, Jenkins, and one of the visiting ranchers would make a stealthy approach to disable the Gatling gun. The remaining defenders would maintain visible positions at the cave to complete the deception. What about you, Mrs. Blackwood? Sullivan asked. Emma checked her Remingtons. I'll provide covering fire for the team targeting the wagon. From that, Western Ridge, I'll have clear sight lines across their entire position. Walsh studied her with newfound respect. Your father would be proud. This is exactly the kind of tactical thinking he was famous for. Let's hope it works as well in practice as it does in theory, Emma replied. We move in 30 minutes. That gives us time to evacuate the non-combatants and get our teams in position before Harrison's deadline expires. The next half hour passed in disciplined preparation. Noah led the children, elderly, and those unwilling to fight through the caves. Back passage, disappearing into the pine forest beyond. Emma watched them go with a silent prayer for their safety, then turned her attention to final preparations. She made her way carefully down the western slope, using natural cover to conceal her movement. Through her field glass, she observed Harrison's men preparing the Gatling gun, removing its canvas cover and positioning it for maximum effect against the cave entrance. Cordell was directing the operation, his scarred face intent as he sighted the weapon toward their position. Emma reached her chosen vantage point, a natural depression behind a large boulder that offered both protection and clear fields of fire. From here, she could see the entire area where Harrison's men were assembled, including the wagon with its deadly cargo. She verified the loads in both Remingtons, then checked Robert's modified Winchester rifle. The weapon was a masterpiece of her husband's craftsmanship. Lightweight, yet sturdy, with improved sights that allowed for exceptional accuracy at ranges beyond standard rifles. Emma had practiced with it extensively, knowing its capabilities and limitations intimately. The appointed time arrived. From her position, Emma saw the first wisps of smoke rising from the eastern slope, quickly growing into visible flames that caught the dry autumn grass. Harrison's men reacted predictably, shouts of alarm rising as attention turned toward this new threat. "It's a diversion," she heard Cordell shout. "Keep your focus on the cave." But several men were already moving toward the rapidly spreading fire, concerned it would circle behind their position. Harrison himself was gesturing urgently, division evident among his forces as they tried to address multiple threats simultaneously. In the midst of this confusion, Emma caught sight of Hawkins and his team making their approach toward the wagon. They moved with impressive stealth, using the natural contours of the land and the distraction of the fire to close distance undetected. Everything was proceeding according to plan until one of Harrison's men, returning from investigating the fire, spotted the approaching team. He shouted a warning, raising his rifle. Emma didn't hesitate. The Winchester came to her shoulder in one fluid motion, and she squeezed the trigger with practiced precision. Her shot caught the man in the shoulder. A disabling wound, rather than a killing one, exactly as intended. He dropped his weapon, crying out in pain and surprise. The shot revealed her position, however. Cordell immediately began directing men toward the western ridge. Emma fired again, this time at the ground near the Gatling gun, forcing Cordell to dive for cover and buying precious seconds for Hawkins' team. They seized the opportunity, rushing the final distance to the wagon. Jenkins tackled the gunner who had been manning the Gatling, while Hawkins and the rancher worked quickly to disable the weapon, removing critical components and tossing them into the nearby creek. Chaos erupted as Harrison's men responded to threats from multiple directions. Emma provided covering fire, her shots precisely placed to disable rather than kill when possible. Her father had taught her that killing should always be the last resort. A wounded enemy required attention from his comrades, effectively removing multiple opponents from the fight. From the cave entrance, Walsh and the remaining defenders opened fire, carefully targeting the ground around Harrison's position, hemming in his forces without directly engaging them. The psychological effect was immediate. Harrison's men found themselves under apparent attack from 3 directions, with no clear avenue of advance or retreat. Sheriff Tanner, displaying unexpected resolution, attempted to rally the men. "Stand your ground. They're just trying to scare us off." His words might have had effect if not for the sudden appearance of Hawkins' team returning from their successful mission, moving in a wide flanking pattern that suggested a larger force than actually existed. Simultaneously, Matthews and his fire-setting team emerged from another direction, completing the illusion that Harrison's men were completely surrounded. Emma continued her selective fire, maintaining pressure without wanton bloodshed. She saw Harrison in urgent conversation with Cordell, their gestures indicating heated disagreement. Finally, Harrison raised his voice loud enough to carry across the battlefield. "Hold your fire! We're withdrawing!" Emma ceased shooting, but maintained her vigilant position. Cordell appeared furious at the decision, arguing vehemently with Harrison, who finally silenced him with a sharp gesture. Under a makeshift white flag, Harrison approached the center of the battleground. "Marshal Walsh," he called out, "I propose a 48-hour truce to allow for consultations with Northwestern's legal department." Walsh emerged cautiously from cover. "A truce requires good faith, Harrison. No further eviction attempts, no property damage, no intimidation of landowners." "Agreed," Harrison replied, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "But Northwestern maintains its legal claim to the right-of-way, as do we maintain our legal ownership of our properties," Walsh countered. The truce merely postpones resolution. It doesn't surrender our position. Emma watched this exchange through her rifle sights, ready to respond if Harrison attempted treachery. But the railroad man appeared genuinely ready to withdraw, at least temporarily. The loss of the Gatling gun, combined with the coordinated resistance and evidence of documented legal complaints, had clearly shaken his confidence. 48 hours, Harrison repeated. We'll withdraw to town. You and your associates may return to your properties unmolested during this period. With that, he turned and walked back to his men. Orders were given, and Harrison's force began an orderly retreat, taking their wounded but leaving behind the disabled Gatling gun, a visual acknowledgement of their tactical defeat. Emma maintained her position until they were well away, then finally allowed herself to relax slightly. She made her way back to the cave entrance, where Walsh, Sullivan, Hawkins, and the others were already gathering. "Is it over?" Sullivan asked as she approached. "Not over," Emma replied realistically. "But we've won valuable time. Harrison's retreating to reassess his options and possibly seek reinforcements." Walsh nodded agreement. Northwestern won't abandon their plans easily, but this changes the dynamic significantly. They've proven willing to employ illegal tactics and deadly force against civilians, something their Eastern investors may not be comfortable supporting once it becomes public knowledge. That wagon returning to town empty-handed sends a powerful message, Hawkins added. Everyone will know Harrison's force was turned back. It undermines his aura of inevitability. Emma surveyed the group of defenders, farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, who had stood together against corporate power backed by corrupted authority. Their unity had accomplished what individual resistance could not. "We should return to our properties while we can," she decided. "Secure what's important, assess damage, prepare for whatever comes next." Harrison agreed to a 48-hour truce, but I wouldn't count on his word beyond what self-interest dictates. As the defenders dispersed, organizing themselves for the return journey, Walsh approached Emma privately. "That was remarkable leadership today," he said quietly. "Your tactical planning, your precision under fire. Franklin Reynolds taught you well." "He taught me that winning doesn't always mean defeating your enemy," Emma replied. "Sometimes it means changing the terms of the conflict until victory becomes possible where it wasn't before." Walsh smiled slightly. "Philosophy and marksmanship, a potent combination. What will you do now?" Emma looked toward the distant outline of her property, just visible through the trees. "Rebuild, recover what I can from Robert's workshop, prepare for Harrison's next move." "You don't have to face that alone anymore," Walsh observed, gesturing to the dispersing defenders. "You've built something here that goes beyond your individual struggle. These people look to you now, not just as an ally, but as a leader." Emma hadn't considered this perspective, but recognized its truth. Her stand against Harrison had catalyzed the community's resistance, transforming isolated individuals into a united force capable of defending their collective interests. By late afternoon, Emma had returned to her farm, accompanied by Noah, Sullivan, and several others who insisted on helping secure her property. The scene that greeted them was sobering. Her house had been ransacked, workshop contents scattered, and various items taken or destroyed in apparent retaliation for her resistance. Yet the land itself remained, the fertile soil, the creek, boundary, the hills beyond. Buildings could be rebuilt, possessions replaced, the most precious items, Robert's journals, his most innovative designs, and her father's tactical manuals, were safely secured in the metal case she had recovered. As she stood surveying the damage, Noah approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry about your home, Mrs. Blackwood." Emma placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Home isn't just buildings, Noah. It's the land, the community, the principles we stand for. Harrison may have damaged the structures, but he hasn't touched what matters most, In the distance, a cloud of dust signaled riders approaching. Emma tensed momentarily before recognizing Hawkins and his sons at the lead of a much larger group, the families who had taken refuge at Clearwater Cave, now returning with wagons loaded with building supplies, food, and other necessities. "Thought you might need some help getting things back in order," Hawkins called out as they drew near. Everyone pitched in what they could spare. Emma was momentarily speechless at this display of community solidarity. Her father had taught her self-reliance above all else. Accepting help had never come easily. Yet here was a different kind of strength, the collective power of people united by common cause and mutual support. As the impromptu rebuilding party organized itself, Sullivan approached with a telegram form in hand. As the impromptu rebuilding party organized itself, Sullivan approached with a telegram form in hand. "Just arrived from Winchester Station," he explained, handing it to Emma. The message was brief but profoundly significant. "Company of 7th Cavalry. Departed Fort Harrison. Stop arriving Clearwater within 36 hours. Stop orders to investigate reports of armed conflict against civilians. Stop Captain Reeves, commanding Stop Emma," passed the telegram to Walsh, who read it with visible relief. "Captain Reeves is a good man," he said, "incorruptible and thorough. Once he documents what's happened here, Northwestern's legal position becomes untenable. Harrison will know this too, once word reaches him," Emma observed. "The question is whether he'll accept defeat or attempt something desperate before military forces arrive." Walsh considered this. Harrison's a businessman at heart, not a true believer. When the cost-benefit calculation shifts decisively against him, he'll cut his losses. Northwestern might even sacrifice him to protect corporate interests, claiming he exceeded his authority. As evening approached, the community's rebuilding efforts had made remarkable progress. The house had been secured and partially restored, temporary repairs made to damaged structures, and work begun on clearing the burned barn site. More importantly, defensive positions had been established around the property with volunteers, organized into watches throughout the night. Emma found herself on the porch as darkness fell, the familiar weight of Robert's Remington at her hip, more a comfort than a burden now. Sullivan joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "Quite a change. From a week ago," he observed, nodding toward the many people still working by lantern light. "When Harrison's men burned your barn, they thought they were breaking your spirit. Instead, they forged a community." "People were always willing to stand together," Emma replied. "They just needed to realize their collective power was stronger than their individual vulnerability. And they needed someone to show them how," Sullivan added meaningfully. "Someone who wouldn't be intimidated, who had both the skills and courage to take the first stand." Emma didn't respond directly to this praise, instead looking toward the horizon where the last colors of sunset were fading. "My father used to say that freedom isn't just something you possess, it's something you must be willing to defend repeatedly. Each generation faces its own version of the same fundamental struggle against those who would use power to take what isn't rightfully theirs." "Wise words," Sullivan acknowledged. "And what would he say about today's events, do you think?" Emma smiled slightly, remembering her father's rare expressions of approval. "He would say we applied the principles correctly: superior position, coordinated action, psychological leverage, and precise application of force." She took a sip of coffee before continuing. "But Robert would have focused on something different, the community that's forming here. He always believed that the true measure of a life wasn't in the battles won, but in the connections forged between people working toward common purpose." As night settled fully over Clearwater Valley, Emma looked out at the lanterns moving about her property. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers becoming allies. A community discovering its collective strength. Harrison and Northwestern Railroad, had come to Clearwater seeing only land to be acquired and resources to be exploited. They had failed to recognize that the true value of this place lay in its people and their determination to stand together, whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Emma knew with certainty that she no longer faced them alone. The widow's farm had become something more, a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for collective action, and perhaps most importantly, the foundation for a community determined to shape its own destiny. Franklin Reynolds had taught his daughter how to win battles. Robert Blackwood had shown her what was truly worth fighting for. Now Emma had discovered something neither man had fully articulated, that the most powerful weapon against tyranny wasn't a perfectly aimed bullet or a clever tactical maneuver, but the unbreakable bonds formed between people united in defense of their shared humanity and common home. As stars appeared in the Montana sky, Emma Blackwood stood watch over not just her own property, but a newborn community taking its first steps toward a future of its own making.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.